Montana Territory, 1876. The dusty streets of Whitetail Creek lay quiet in the midday sun, shadows stretched thin under the weight of August heat. Thomas Steele sat high in the saddle of his chestnut gelding, surveying the small frontier town with weary eyes that had seen too much of the West's cruelty. At 26, most would call him young, but the hard years of frontier living had aged him beyond his years, though not in his appearance. His lean, muscular frame remained unmarred by the typical weathering that claimed most cowboys. His jaw, sharp and defined, carried only the shadow of a day's stubble, rather than the wild beards common to men who spent weeks on the range. Thomas pulled his hat lower, shielding eyes the color of a Montana sky from the relentless sun. He had learned long ago that the frontier was no place for sentimentality. In the 3 years since he'd left his family's failed farm in Missouri, he had built his reputation as a capable ranch hand and occasional bounty hunter, a man who kept to himself and never stayed in one place long enough for attachment to take root. "Keep moving, keep breathing," he muttered to his horse. It was the mantra that had carried him through the war as a boy soldier and across the unforgiving plains as a man. Relationships meant vulnerability, vulnerability meant weakness, and weakness got you killed in a land where nature and man competed to see which could be more merciless. The letter in his breast pocket weighed heavy against his heart. News of his father's passing had reached him 2 weeks prior, the final severance of his ties to anything resembling home. Not that there had been much warmth there to begin with, just obligation, disappointment, and eventually escape. Whitetail Creek hadn't been his destination, no place ever was. Thomas simply rode until either work or exhaustion gave him reason to stop. This particular town, nestled in a green valley beneath the shadow of the Bitterroot Mountains, was merely a place to resupply before continuing his aimless journey. He'd take on whatever work was available, breaking horses, hunting down stolen cattle, or guarding a shipment, then move on before anyone could peer too deeply into the emptiness he carried. The town's single street boasted the usual establishments. A general store with peeling white paint, a saloon with windows grimy from cigarette smoke, a small church that doubled as a schoolhouse, and a 2-story building proudly displaying a sign reading Whitetail Creek Hotel and Restaurant. Between these stood smaller businesses, a blacksmith, barber, and the sheriff's office with its adjoining jail cell visible through barred windows. Thomas dismounted outside the general store, tying his horse to the hitching post with practiced ease. He needed supplies, coffee, ammunition, salt pork, and perhaps a new shirt if the prices weren't too dear. After that, the saloon would provide a hot meal and information on any work available in the area. You passing through or looking to stay a spell. The shopkeeper was a portly man with spectacles perched on a bulbous nose, his apron smudged with the dust of merchandise. "Just passing," Thomas replied curtly, gathering his purchases. The shopkeeper nodded knowingly. Most young men are, though there's good opportunities here for those willing to put down roots. The Churchill Ranch is always hiring, and rumors say the railroad might be coming through next year. Thomas offered a non-committal grunt. He'd heard similar promises in a dozen towns across 3 territories. The future was a luxury he'd stopped investing in long ago. Plans led to disappointment, hopes to heartache. Better to live day by day, taking whatever the world offered without expectation of more. As he paid for his supplies, a commotion erupted outside, raised voices, and the sharp cry of a child. Thomas instinctively reached for the Colt revolver holstered at his hip before forcing his hand to relax. Not his business, not his fight. Yet when he stepped back onto the wooden boardwalk, the scene before him made something long dormant stir in his chest. A young woman stood in the dusty street, clutching the hand of a small boy no more than 5 years old. She wore a faded blue dress that had once been fine, but now showed the unmistakable signs of reduced circumstances, carefully mended tiers and hems let down to accommodate continued wear. Despite this, she carried herself with dignity, her back straight as she faced the town's sheriff and what appeared to be the local banker. She was beautiful in a way that transcended her obvious exhaustion, her features delicate yet strong, framed by hair the color of wheat under summer sun, falling in loose waves to her shoulders. Even from a distance, Thomas could see her eyes were an unusual shade of green, bright against her sun-kissed skin. "Please," she was saying, her voice wavering but determined, "my husband's claim is valid. The deed is registered in Bozeman. I just need time to retrieve the papers." The banker, a thin man with cold eyes, shook his head. "Mrs. Adler, we've heard this tale for weeks now. Without proof of ownership, that homestead belongs to whoever can work it. The Territorial Land Office has been quite clear. My son and I work it, she insisted, and Thomas noticed for the first time how her hands were calloused and her arms tanned from labor. A woman and a child cannot properly develop 160 acres, the banker replied with barely concealed disdain. The Homestead Act requires improvements to be made. Your husband's been dead 6 months now, and we've planted 10 acres and repaired the cabin, she interrupted, color rising in her cheeks. The law gives us 5 years to prove up the claim. The sheriff, looking uncomfortable with the public confrontation, placed a hand on the banker's shoulder. Perhaps we could give Mrs. Adler another week to produce the paperwork. The banker shrugged off the hand. The Churchill Ranch has offered fair market value for the property. If Mrs. Adler cannot prove ownership by Saturday next, I will process their claim. Thomas watched the woman's shoulders stiffen. Even from where he stood, he could see the mixture of fury and desperation in her eyes. The little boy pressed closer to her skirts, his small face solemn, with a child's understanding of adult troubles. Please, she said again, her voice lower now. I have nowhere else to go. Please help my child, if not me. Something in those words, or perhaps in the quiet dignity with which she spoke them, pierced through the armor Thomas had built around himself. Before he could reconsider, he found himself stepping forward. I believe the lady said she needs time to retrieve papers from Bozeman, he said, his deep voice carrying across the sudden silence of the street. All eyes turned to him, a stranger involving himself in town business. The banker assessed him with a quick, dismissive glance, taking in his trail-worn clothes and the revolver at his hip. This doesn't concern you, cowboy. Actually, Thomas continued, surprising himself with each word, I'm headed toward Bozeman tomorrow. I could deliver a message to the land office, perhaps speed things along. The woman's green eyes widened, hope and suspicion warring in her gaze. You would do that for strangers? For the first time in years, Thomas felt something crack in the wall he'd built around himself. Sometimes strangers are the only ones worth helping, ma'am. They haven't had time to disappoint you yet. A flicker of something, recognition perhaps of the cynicism behind his words, crossed her face. Rebecca Adler, she said simply, extending her hand, and this is my son, James. Thomas Steele, he replied, taking her hand briefly. Her grip was stronger than he'd expected, her palm roughened by work. The banker cleared his throat. This changes nothing. Saturday next is the deadline, papers or no papers. Rebecca Adler's chin lifted. I understand perfectly, Mr. Davis. She turned back to Thomas, her expression guarded yet grateful. Mr. Steele, if you truly mean to help, perhaps we could discuss the details. My wagon is just there. Thomas nodded, aware that he was deviating from his own rules of engagement with the world. Involvement led to entanglement, entanglement to obligation, yet he followed her to a small wagon where a weary-looking mule stood in harness. You don't need to actually go to Bozeman, she said quietly once they were out of earshot. I was grateful for your intervention, but you don't trust a stranger's help, Thomas finished for her. The ghost of a smile touched her lips. Can you blame me? Kindness usually comes with conditions out here. The boy James studied Thomas with solemn brown eyes. Unlike many children who shied away from his imposing presence, the boy seemed to be taking his measure, deciding whether this tall stranger was friend or foe. No conditions, Thomas said, surprising himself again, but I am curious why you can't just ride to Bozeman yourself. Rebecca glanced toward the banker, who was still watching them from across the street. The truth is there are no papers in Bozeman. My husband Daniel registered our claim at the land office, but he died before receiving the final deed. Without proof of marriage or his death certificate, they won't transfer the homestead to me. And those papers? With my father insent. Louis, I've written, but, she shrugged, the gesture encompassing all the uncertainty of frontier communications. Thomas considered the woman before him. At perhaps 20 years old, she was younger than he'd initially thought, too young to be widowed with a child in this harsh country. Yet there was steel beneath her fatigue, a determination he recognized from his own battles with the frontier's indifference. What will you do if the banker follows through on Saturday? Rebecca's hands tightened on the wagon's edge. Fight, hide, run if necessary. That land is James's inheritance. I won't let Churchill steal it simply because he's powerful and I'm, she trailed off. A woman alone, Thomas finished softly. She nodded, a flash of vulnerability crossing her face before being replaced by resolve. A poor widow with a young child, the oldest story in the West, Mr. Steele. The boy tugged at his mother's skirt. Mama, I'm thirsty. Rebecca immediately reached for a canteen, her attention shifting completely to her son. Thomas watched as she knelt, brushing the boy's dark hair from his forehead with a tenderness that made something ache in his chest. Here was love undiminished by hardship, connection untainted by the frontier's harshness. It was something he had convinced himself did not exist in this merciless land. Mr. Steele, she said, looking up at him as she secured the canteen's cap, thank you for your kindness today. It's rare enough to be treasured, even if it changes nothing in the end. Thomas found himself saying, perhaps it doesn't have to end on Saturday. The words surprised him as much as they seemed to surprise her. I have some experience with land disputes, let me help. Why? The directness of her question matched the straightforward assessment in her eyes. Thomas could have offered any number of practical reasons: boredom, a sense of justice, the promise of payment once the situation resolved. Instead, he found himself speaking a truth he rarely acknowledged even to himself, because sometimes doing the right thing is the only way to remember who you are. Something in her expression softened. Then I accept your help, Mr. Steele, though I should warn you, Edward Churchill is not a man who takes opposition lightly. Neither am I, Thomas replied, the old familiar coldness settling into his voice. He helped Rebecca and James into their wagon, aware that he was committing himself to exactly the kind of entanglement he had spent years avoiding. As he watched them drive toward the edge of town, presumably toward their contested homestead, Thomas wondered what had possessed him to involve himself in their troubles. The truth, though he was loath to admit it, was simple. In Rebecca Adler's determined defense of her son's future, he had glimpsed something he had convinced himself was mythical on the frontier. A love strong enough to stand against both man and nature's cruelty, and some forgotten part of him wanted to protect that rarity, even if he could never experience it himself. Thomas turned toward the saloon, suddenly in need of whiskey and information. If he was going to help the widow Adler, he needed to know exactly what and who he was up against. The Broken Spur Saloon smelled of stale beer, tobacco, and unwashed bodies, familiar comforts to a man accustomed to trail life. Thomas claimed a corner table with his back to the wall, ordered a whiskey and whatever passed for dinner, then settled in to listen. Saloons were the lifeblood of information in frontier towns. Men loosened by drink spoke freely of matters they'd otherwise keep private. It didn't take long to hear Churchill's name mentioned. Edward Churchill, it seemed, had arrived in the Montana Territory 5 years earlier with enough capital to establish what was now the largest cattle operation in the county. His ranch employed a dozen men, including some with questionable pasts who served as his private enforcers. The banker Davis was deep in Churchill's pocket, as were several other business owners in town. Widow Adler's fighting a losing battle, muttered an old-timer at the bar. Shame, too. Her husband was a good man, served in the Union Army, came west to build something clean after all that bloodshed. How'd he die? Thomas asked, sliding onto a bar stool and ordering a drink for the old man, who introduced himself as Riley, the town's blacksmith. Rock slide out near Copper Creek, left the poor woman with a half-built cabin, a field only partly cleared, and a young boy to raise alone. Riley shook his head. She's done remarkable well, considering. Got that field planted come spring, finished the cabin roof herself. Strong woman. Too strong for her own good, added another man, this one wearing the dust of the livery stable. Churchill offered to buy her out 3 times. Each time she refused, something bad happened. Tools went missing. A section of fence got torn down. Her mule came up lame. Thomas sipped his whiskey, letting the burn chase away the anger rising in his throat. And the sheriff. Decent enough man, but he knows where his bread is buttered, Riley replied. Won't directly cross Churchill unless there's no alternative. How long has the widow been here? The Adlers came about 2 years back. Homesteaded that nice little valley piece just east of town. Good water, sheltered position, prime land. Riley studied Thomas over his whiskey glass. What's your interest in all this, stranger? Thomas gave the answer he'd prepared. Looking for ranch work, like to know what kind of man might be signing my pay vouchers. Riley seemed to accept this explanation, but his next words carried a warning. Churchill pays well and on time. But cross him and you'll find yourself unwelcome in this valley right quick. he doesn't forget slights, real or imagined. After finishing his meal and gathering what information he could, Thomas secured a room at the hotel. From its second-story window, he could see the main street and beyond the town's edge, the rolling hills that gradually rose toward the distant mountains. Somewhere out there, Rebecca Adler was likely putting her son to bed, wondering if the stranger who'd offered help would actually follow through. Thomas removed his gun belt and laid it carefully across the room's single chair before stretching out on the narrow bed. His usual pattern would have been to gather supplies, maybe take on a quick job for cash, then move on within days. Attachments were dangerous, they gave the world leverage against you, yet here he was, willingly inserting himself into a stranger's fight against powerful local interests. Fool, he muttered to himself in the darkness. But the image of Rebecca Adler standing proud despite her circumstances, of her small son watching with solemn eyes too old for his years, wouldn't leave him. Perhaps this was just a way to postpone his own aimless wandering. Or perhaps, though he was reluctant to admit it even to himself, he simply couldn't stand by and watch another good person be broken by the frontier's ruthlessness. Too many already had been, including himself. Thomas fell asleep planning his next move, dreaming of wheat gold hair and determined green eyes. Dawn found Thomas already awake and dressed, his few possessions packed and ready. After a quick breakfast at the hotel restaurant, he rode out toward the Adler homestead, guided by directions from Riley the blacksmith. The morning was cool, the sky vast and blue overhead, the kind of perfect summer day that made one forget how quickly the Montana territory could turn deadly. The Adler claim lay about 3 miles east of town, nestled in a small valley with a clear creek running through it. As Thomas crested a rise, the homestead came into view below. A sturdy log cabin with a newly finished roof, a small barn, and about 10 acres of tilled land where corn and wheat grew in neat rows. It wasn't large or grand, but it represented something that had become increasingly rare as speculators and cattle barons claimed more territory, a family building something of their own from nothing but hard work and determination. Thomas was halfway down the slope when he spotted Rebecca in the garden beside the cabin, kneeling among rows of vegetables with a wide-brimmed hat shielding her from the morning sun. She stood as he approached, one hand shading her eyes while the other gripped a garden hoe with the easy familiarity of a woman accustomed to defending herself. "Mr. Steele," she called as he drew closer. "I wasn't certain you'd come." Thomas dismounted, leading his horse the final distance, said I would. Rebecca studied him, her expression guarded yet hopeful. In the clear morning light, Thomas could see details he'd missed in town. She was younger than he'd initially thought, perhaps 20 or 21, with a dusting of freckles across her nose and a small scar near her left temple. Her dress, though worn, was clean and carefully mended, the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms tanned and strong from outdoor work. "Have you decided how you plan to help?" she asked directly, setting aside the hoe and brushing soil from her hands. "That depends on what you want," Thomas replied. "I could ride to Bozeman, see if there's any record of your husband's claim at the land office. Or I could stay here, help secure the property, until your papers arrive from St. Louis." Rebecca's expression shifted, surprise replacing caution. "You'd stay." "If that's what's needed." She hesitated, clearly weighing his offer against her natural wariness of a stranger's assistance. Before she could respond, James came running from behind the cabin, his small face lighting up at the sight of Thomas's horse. "Mama, look, a real cowboy horse." The boy skidded to a stop beside his mother, eyeing Thomas with the combination of caution and fascination typical of frontier children encountering strangers. Thomas knelt to the boy's level. "His name is Rusty. Would you like to pet him?" James looked to his mother for permission. When she nodded, he approached cautiously, reaching out to stroke the horse's velvety nose. Rusty, gentle despite his size, lowered his head obligingly. "He likes you," Thomas observed, watching the child's delight. "I like horses," James confided. "Papa was teaching me to ride before he went to heaven. He said every man needs to know horses in the West." Thomas felt a pang at the simple statement. "Your papa was right about that." Rebecca cleared her throat, her hand resting protectively on her son's shoulder. "James, why don't you check on the chickens while Mr. Steele and I talk?" The boy nodded, gave Rusty one final pat, then ran toward a small coop beside the barn. Thomas stood, noting the maternal pride and fierce protectiveness in Rebecca's eyes as she watched her son. "He's a fine boy," Thomas said quietly. He is everything to me, she replied simply. Then with a deep breath she turned back to face him. Mr. Steele, I appreciate your offer, but I must be direct. I have nothing to pay you with right now. This season's crop is my only income, and it won't be harvested for months. I'm not looking for payment. Her eyes narrowed slightly. Then what are you looking for? Most men want something. The directness of her question matched the straightforward assessment in her gaze. Thomas respected her wariness. It had likely kept her and her son alive in a world that was especially harsh to women alone. Right now I'm between jobs, he said honestly. Was heading north toward the Canadian border, but I've got no pressing engagements. Helping you resolve this land dispute seems a worthwhile detour. And afterward, she pressed. When this is settled one way or another. Thomas shrugged. I move on, that's what I do. Something in his tone must have convinced her of his sincerity, because Rebecca nodded slowly. Very well, I accept your help, Mr. Steele. And I believe having you here would be more valuable than sending you to Bozeman. Churchill's men have become more persistent in their visits lately. The implication in her words made Thomas's jaw tighten. Have they threatened you directly? Not in so many words, but last week 3 of them rode through my cornfield by accident. The week before, I found one of them inspecting my property line markers. Her voice remained steady, but Thomas noticed her hands had clenched at her sides. They're trying to frighten me into selling before my deadline. And the sheriff. Rebecca's laugh held no humor. Says he can't spare deputies to watch one homestead when there's a whole county to patrol. Besides, no laws were broken, just unfortunate misunderstandings. Thomas nodded, understanding the situation all too clearly. It was a story repeated across the West, powerful interests using intimidation and legal technicalities to absorb smaller holdings. Usually they succeeded. Show me around, he said. I'd like to understand what we're defending. Rebecca gave him a thorough tour of the homestead, speaking with quiet pride of the improvements she and her husband had made to the raw land. The cabin, though small, was well built, with tight-fitting logs and a stone fireplace that would keep the interior warm during Montana's brutal winters. The barn housed 2 milk cows, a team of oxen, and Rebecca's mule, along with a small forge where Daniel Adler had done his own blacksmithing. Daniel was building a larger house over there, Rebecca explained, pointing to a half-finished foundation near a stand of pines. We were going to move the cabin once it was done, use this as a workshop. Her voice faltered slightly. He had so many plans. Thomas studied her profile as she gazed at the abandoned foundation. Despite her obvious grief, there was no self-pity in her expression, only a determined acceptance of the hand life had dealt her. It was a quality he had rarely encountered, this ability to face hardship without being broken by it. Your husband chose well, he said quietly, both the land and the woman strong enough to hold it. Rebecca turned to him, surprise evident in her eyes. Thank you, Mr. Steele. That's perhaps the kindest thing anyone has said to me since Daniel died. They continued the tour, Rebecca explaining her plans for irrigation and expansion of the fields, her knowledge of farming impressive for someone so young. By the time they returned to the cabin, Thomas had a clear understanding of not just the property's physical layout, but of what it represented to Rebecca and her son, a future built by their own hands, independence in a world that offered few choices to a woman alone. I'll stable my horse and set up in the barn, Thomas said as they approached the cabin. Better to have me there in case of night visitors. Rebecca looked as though she might argue, then nodded. I'll bring you bedding and a lantern. And you'll take your meals with us, of course. As Thomas led Rusty toward the barn, James fell into step beside him, looking up with curious eyes. Are you staying to help us fight the bad men, Mr. Steele? Thomas glanced down at the solemn-faced child. What makes you think they're bad men? They made Mama cry when they said Papa's land wasn't ours anymore. The boy's expression hardened with a determination that mirrored his mother's. I tried to shoot them with my slingshot, but Mama made me stop. Despite the seriousness of the situation, Thomas felt a smile tug at his lips. Well, I'm staying to help you and your mama sort things out. And yes, sometimes that might mean standing up to men who aren't being fair. James nodded, satisfied with this answer. Good, Mama's strong, but Papa said sometimes even strong people need friends. The simple wisdom in the child's words struck Thomas deeply. For years, he had convinced himself that strength meant standing alone, needing no one. Yet here was this boy, who had already lost his father to the frontier's dangers, understanding what Thomas had forgotten, that true strength often came from connection, not isolation. By nightfall, Thomas was settled in the barn, his bedroll spread on clean hay in a corner with a good view of both the main door and the cabin beyond. He had spent the afternoon helping Rebecca repair a section of fence, working in comfortable silence broken only by necessary communication. She was clearly capable, wielding tools with the competence of someone who had learned to rely on herself, yet accepting his assistance without false pride. After a simple but filling supper of rabbit stew and cornbread, Rebecca had put James to bed with a story Thomas could hear faintly through the cabin's open window, something about a clever fox outsmarting a greedy wolf. The metaphor wasn't lost on him. Now, as darkness settled over the valley and crickets began their nightly chorus, Thomas sat on a stump outside the barn, cleaning his revolver with the methodical precision that had become second nature. The night was peaceful, stars pricking the vast Montana sky like diamond dust scattered across black velvet. It was hard to imagine, in such tranquility, that this small homestead stood at the center of a brewing conflict. The cabin door opened, spilling golden lamplight onto the packed earth of the yard. Rebecca emerged, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the evening chill. She walked toward him, her approach deliberate but unhurried. "James is asleep," she said, stopping a few feet away. "He was exhausted from following you around all afternoon." Thomas smiled slightly. "He's a good helper, smart too." "Too smart sometimes," Rebecca agreed, her expression softening at the mention of her son. "He sees and understands more than a 5-year-old should." She hesitated, then asked, "May I join you for a moment?" Thomas nodded, setting aside his revolver and moving over to make space on the wide stump. Rebecca sat beside him, maintaining a proper distance, her gaze lifting to the star-filled sky. "I forget to look up sometimes," she said softly. "There's always so much that needs doing on the ground that I forget to remember how beautiful it is here." Thomas followed her gaze upward. "My father used to say the stars are God's way of reminding us how small our troubles are." "Did you believe him?" The question surprised him with its directness. "Not really. Troubles feel plenty big when you're in the middle of them, no matter how many stars are shining." Rebecca turned to study his profile in the dim light. "You're not what I expected, Mr. Steele." "Call me Thomas," he said, surprising himself with the invitation. "And what did you expect?" "From a cowboy who offers to help strangers," she shrugged slightly. "Someone simpler perhaps, less," she seemed to search for the right word. "Less acquainted with loss." Thomas felt oddly exposed under her perceptive gaze. "What makes you think I know anything about loss?" "It's in your eyes," Rebecca said simply. "When you watched James, when you spoke of your father. You carry it like I do, not as something that defines you, but as something that shaped you." The accuracy of her assessment unsettled him. Thomas had spent years ensuring that his expressions revealed nothing, that his manner gave away no vulnerabilities. Yet this young widow had seen through his carefully constructed facade within a day. "We should discuss strategy," he said, deliberately changing the subject. "Saturday gives us 4 days to either find documentation of your claim or convince Churchill to back down." If Rebecca noticed his evasion, she didn't comment on it. "I've written to my father again, but even if he sends the marriage certificate and Daniel's death papers immediately, they won't arrive in time." "Then we focus on Churchill," Thomas said, thinking aloud. "Men like him understand power and leverage. Right now, he thinks he has both." "And how do we change that?" Thomas considered the question carefully. "First, we need to understand exactly why he wants this particular piece of land. The valley is pretty, the soil good, but there's plenty of unclaimed land in the territory. Why is he so set on yours?" Rebecca frowned, her brow furrowing in thought. "I've wondered that myself. He first approached Daniel about selling just a month after we'd settled, offered twice what the land would normally be worth." "That's interesting," Thomas murmured. "Could be water rights. Or maybe there's something else valuable here, minerals, perhaps." Daniel was convinced it was simply because our land sits between Churchill's main pastures and the railroad survey line, Rebecca said. "If the railroad comes through, whoever controls access to it controls shipping for the entire valley." Thomas nodded slowly. That would explain his persistence. Control the shipping, control the profits. They sat in silence for a moment, each considering the implications. Finally, Rebecca stood, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Whatever his reasons, Edward Churchill is not a man who accepts defeat gracefully, she said quietly. If you're going to help us, Thomas, you should know what you're risking. His reach extends beyond this valley. I'm not afraid of men like Churchill, Thomas replied, his voice hardening. I've faced worse. Rebecca studied him in the starlight, her expression unreadable. I believe you have, she said finally. But that doesn't mean you should have to face them again on my account. Maybe it's not just on your account, Thomas surprised himself by saying. Maybe some fights are worth taking on because they're right. Something shifted in Rebecca's eyes, a softening, perhaps, or recognition of something kindred. Thank you, she said simply. Good night, Thomas. As she walked back to the cabin, her figure silhouetted against the warm light from its windows, Thomas found himself wondering what had possessed him to speak so openly. He had spent years cultivating a careful distance from others, maintaining the isolation that had become his protection against the world's cruelties. Yet something about Rebecca Adler, her quiet strength, her clear-eyed assessment of their situation, her devotion to her son, had bypassed those defenses with disconcerting ease. Thomas returned to his bedroll in the barn, listening to the night sounds of the homestead, the soft lowing of the cows, the rustle of wind through cornfields, the distant call of a coyote. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he felt a sense of purpose that went beyond mere survival. Whether that purpose would lead to salvation or ruin remained to be seen. The first test of Thomas's resolve came earlier than expected. He woke before dawn to the sound of approaching horses, 3 or 4, moving at an unhurried pace along the track that led to the homestead. In the gray pre-dawn light, he could make out their silhouettes against the eastern sky. 3 riders, their postures suggesting confidence rather than caution. Thomas pulled on his boots and gun belt, positioning himself in the barn doorway where he had a clear view of the yard and cabin. Rebecca appeared on her porch moments later, a shotgun in her hands and her hair hastily tied back. She had clearly been awakened by the same sounds. Stay inside, Thomas called to her in a low voice. Let me handle this. She hesitated, then nodded, stepping back into the cabin doorway where she could observe while remaining partially sheltered. Thomas appreciated her prudence. She was no shrinking violet needing protection, but neither was she foolhardy. The riders drew up about 50 feet from the cabin, spreading out slightly in a formation that Thomas recognized as tactical, designed to prevent a single shooter from targeting all 3 at once. The man in the center was older, perhaps in his 40s, with a weathered face and the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. The 2 flanking him were younger and harder-looking, their hands resting casually near holstered weapons. Mrs. Adler, the older man called. Apologies for the early hour, but Mr. Churchill was concerned when he heard about yesterday's misunderstanding in town. Thomas stepped forward, moving deliberately into the open. Mrs. Adler is occupied. I'll relay any messages. The spokesman's eyes narrowed as he assessed Thomas, taking in the gun belt and the confident stance. Don't believe we've been introduced, friend. I'm Garrett, foreman at the Churchill Ranch. These are Williams and Doyle. He gestured to his companions without taking his eyes off Thomas. Thomas Steele, Thomas replied evenly, currently employed by Mrs. Adler. Garrett's eyebrows rose. That's so. Funny, hadn't heard the widow was hiring. Private arrangement, Thomas said. He remained relaxed but alert, noting how the younger men had tensed at his appearance, their right hands now resting on their holstered revolvers. What's your business here? Like I said, Mr. Churchill heard about yesterday's unpleasantness in town, wanted to extend one final offer before things get complicated. Garrett reached into his coat and withdrew an envelope. $700 for the property, as is. That's 3 times what they paid originally. Mrs. Adler isn't interested in selling, Thomas stated flatly, not at any price. That's for the lady to decide, don't you think? Garrett's tone remained conversational, but his eyes had hardened. Unless your employment extends to making her business decisions. From the cabin doorway, Rebecca spoke up. Mr. Garrett, my answer to Mr. Churchill remains the same as it has been since my husband died. This land is not for sale, not for $700, not for $7,000. Garrett sighed as though genuinely disappointed. Mrs. Adler, please consider your situation reasonably. You're a woman alone. She's not alone, Thomas interrupted, his hand dropping casually to rest near his revolver. Garrett studied him for a long moment, clearly reassessing the situation. One hired gun doesn't change the facts, Steele. Saturday, the bank will process Mr. Churchill's claim. You'd be wise to take the money and find somewhere new to start over, Mrs. Adler. And you'd be wise to leave my property now, Rebecca replied firmly. The tension stretched between them, a palpable thing in the early morning light. Thomas remained perfectly still, his eyes steady on Garrett's face. He had been in enough confrontations to recognize the signs of a man weighing his options, calculating risks and potential rewards. After several seconds, Garrett nodded slightly. As you wish. The offer remains open until Saturday noon. He tucked the envelope back into his coat, then tipped his hat with mock courtesy. Ma'am, Steele. The three men turned their horses and rode away at an unhurried pace, conveying clearly that they were leaving by choice rather than intimidation. Thomas remained in place until they disappeared over the rise, then turned toward the cabin. Rebecca had lowered her shotgun but still stood in the doorway, her expression a mixture of defiance and concern. They'll be back, Thomas said quietly as he approached. I know. Rebecca's grip on the shotgun tightened momentarily before she consciously relaxed it. That was mild compared to some of their previous visits. Your presence changed the dynamic. They were testing me, seeing if I could be intimidated or bought off. Rebecca's green eyes met his directly. Can you be bought off? No, Thomas replied simply. The question didn't offend him. It was practical, the sort of thing anyone with sense would ask. But they'll try again, with more men or different tactics. She nodded, accepting his assessment. James is still asleep, thankfully. I'd prefer he not witness these confrontations when possible. She hesitated, then added, Would you like coffee? I was about to make some when our visitors arrived. The domestic offer, so normal amid their tense circumstances, brought an unexpected smile to Thomas's lips. Coffee would be welcome. Inside, the cabin was smaller than it appeared from outside, but meticulously organized to make the most of its limited space. A central room served as both kitchen and living area, with a stone fireplace along one wall. A curtain partially concealed a sleeping area in the rear, where Thomas could see James's small form still bundled under quilts. Everything was scrupulously clean, despite the rough frontier conditions, with small touches, dried flowers in a tin can, a colorful quilt on the rocking chair, books stacked neatly on a shelf that spoke of Rebecca's determination to create a home rather than merely a shelter. It's not much, Rebecca said quietly, noting his survey of the space, but it's ours. It's more than many have, Thomas replied, thinking of his own years of drifting, sleeping under stars or in anonymous boarding houses, owning nothing that couldn't be carried on horseback. Rebecca busied herself at the small cast-iron stove, heating water for coffee and mixing batter for what smelled like cornbread. Thomas stood somewhat awkwardly, unused to being inside domestic spaces. After a moment, Rebecca gestured to the small table with its two chairs. Please sit, this won't take long. Thomas removed his hat and took a seat, watching as she moved efficiently around the small kitchen. There was grace in her movements, a quiet confidence that spoke of competence rather than training. This was not a woman who had been raised to frontier hardships. He could see it in the way she occasionally paused to push her hair back with the back of her wrist, in the slight hesitation before tackling certain tasks. She had learned these skills out of necessity, not heritage. Where are you from originally? He asked. Rebecca glanced over her shoulder, surprised by the personal question. St. Louis. My father is a professor at the university there. She poured coffee into 2 tin cups and brought them to the table, sitting across from him. Daniel was one of his students, brilliant with mathematics and engineering. They said he could have designed bridges for the railroads. Instead, he chose farming. A soft smile touched her lips. He chose adventure, and me, much to my father's initial dismay. Daniel believed the future was out here, in these new territories where a man could build something from nothing. Her smile faded slightly. He was right about the opportunity. Perhaps less right about the dangers. Thomas sipped his coffee, finding it surprisingly good, real coffee, not the chicory substitute common in frontier households. And you? Did you share his vision of frontier life? I shared his belief in possibilities, Rebecca replied thoughtfully. The idea that we could create our own world by our own rules. That James could grow up free from the constraints and prejudices of established society. She met Thomas's eyes over her cup, but I was young and romanticized the difficulties. I had read about pioneer women, but never truly understood until I became one. Yet you stayed, even after your husband died. This is James's inheritance, she said simply, as if that explained everything. Perhaps it did. And I discovered I'm stronger than I knew. Each challenge I overcome here is mine, my victory, my accomplishment. That has its own value. Thomas nodded, understanding completely. He had seen many settlers broken by the frontier's harsh realities, retreating east with dreams shattered and spirits crushed. Those who remained were a special breed, stubborn, resilient, often unreasonable in their determination. Rebecca Adler clearly belonged to this category. "What about you, Thomas?" she asked, turning the conversation. "You're not from this territory originally." "Missouri," he answered. "Small farm near Springfield." "And your family?" Thomas hesitated. It had been years since he'd spoken of his past to anyone. "Gone now. Father died recently, mother during the war. Brother at Shiloh." Rebecca's expression softened with genuine sympathy. "I'm sorry, the war took so much from so many." Yes, Thomas didn't elaborate. The war had taken more than his brother's life. It had taken his own youth, his innocence, his belief in humanity's fundamental goodness. At 16, he had lied about his age to join the Union Army alongside his older brother. At 17, he had seen things no boy should witness, done things that still haunted his dreams. By 18, when the war finally ended, Thomas Steele had already become the hard-eyed, self-reliant man who trusted nothing and no one. Rebecca seemed to sense his reluctance to discuss the subject further, and since then, you've been a cowboy. Among other things, ranch hand, trail driver, occasional bounty hunter. Thomas shrugged. "I go where work takes me. No place to call home." The question was innocent enough, but it struck deeper than Rebecca could know. Home. The concept had become abstract to Thomas, more theoretical than real. Home required attachment, permanence, vulnerability, all things he had systematically eliminated from his life. "The West is my home," he answered finally. "All of it and none of it." Rebecca studied him, her green eyes seeming to see more than he intended to reveal. Before she could respond, a sleepy voice called from behind the curtain. "Mama." Her attention immediately shifted, maternal instinct overriding all else. "I'm here, James, come have breakfast." The boy emerged, tousle-haired and yawning, his face lighting up when he saw Thomas at the table. "Mr. Steele." "You're still here." "Said I would be," Thomas replied, unable to prevent a smile at the child's obvious delight. There was something disarming about James's unguarded enthusiasm, so unlike the careful wariness that characterized most of Thomas's interactions with others. As they ate breakfast, cornbread with honey and more of the excellent coffee, Thomas listened to James chatter about his plans for the day, which seemed to involve showing Mr. Steele every inch of the homestead, particularly his special hiding places and a fort he was building in the nearby woods. Rebecca gently redirected him, reminding him that Thomas was there to work, not play. "But he can do both," James insisted with a child's logic. "Papa always said work and play can be the same thing if you love what you're doing." Something about the boy's words, or perhaps the way Rebecca's expression mingled pride and pain at the mention of her husband, struck Thomas deeply. When had he last loved anything he was doing? When had work and purpose aligned in a way that brought satisfaction rather than merely survival? "Tell you what," Thomas said to James. "I need to check the property boundaries today, make sure everything is secure. You could be my guide, show me the landmarks." James's face lit up with importance. "I know all the markers, Papa showed me. There's a big oak tree at the north corner, and a stack of rocks in the east field, and—" "Perfect," Thomas interrupted gently. "You'll be a big help." Rebecca gave Thomas a grateful look over her son's head. "That would be a relief, actually. I need to go into town for supplies, and I've been worried about taking James with me given the current tensions." "You shouldn't go alone," Thomas said immediately, concern sharpening his voice. "I'll be fine in daylight in the middle of town," she assured him. "Churchill wouldn't risk anything so public, and frankly, we need flour and ammunition, neither of which can wait until this situation resolves." Thomas recognized the practical necessity, though he didn't like it. Take my revolver, he said, unholstering his Colt and placing it on the table. I've got another in my saddlebags. Rebecca eyed the weapon with clear familiarity. I appreciate the offer, but I have my own. She rose and reached to a high shelf, retrieving a small derringer. Daniel insisted I learn to use it, said a frontier woman needed protection when he was away working the fields. Thomas nodded, impressed by her pragmatism. Too many women on the frontier remained helpless due to propriety or misguided chivalry. Good, but be careful anyway. Men like Churchill have long memories and little patience. I've dealt with Edward Churchill for 6 months now, Rebecca replied, a hint of steel entering her voice. I'm well acquainted with his methods. After breakfast, Rebecca prepared to leave for town while Thomas and James set out to inspect the property boundaries. The boy proved to be an excellent guide, showing Thomas the carefully placed markers that define the Adler claim, 160 acres of mixed forest and farmland, with the creek running diagonally through it. James spoke constantly as they walked, peppering Thomas with questions about his horse, his gun, the places he'd been. Unlike many adults who found the boy's curiosity exhausting, Thomas enjoyed his straightforward inquiries and unfiltered observations. There was something refreshing about a mind untainted by cynicism or guile. Papa said a man's word is his bond, James informed Thomas solemnly as they examined a boundary marker that appeared to have been recently moved. Is that true everywhere? Thomas considered how to answer honestly without destroying the boy's idealism. It should be true everywhere, he said finally, and with honorable men it is, but not everyone lives by that code. James absorbed this, his small face serious. How do you know who's honorable? That's the hard part, Thomas admitted, replacing the stone marker in what he judged to be its original position. Sometimes you don't know until they've given their word and either kept it or broken it. Is Mr. Churchill honorable? The directness of the question momentarily caught Thomas off guard. I don't know him well enough to say, Thomas replied carefully, but a truly honorable man wouldn't try to take what belongs to others. James nodded, satisfied with this assessment. That's what Mama says too. She says we have to be better than them, even when it's hard. Thomas felt a surge of respect for Rebecca, who had managed to instill values in her son despite their difficult circumstances. Many in her position would have become bitter, teaching their children that survival justified any means. Instead, she was raising James to understand the importance of integrity even in a world that often rewarded its absence. By midday, Thomas had a clear picture of the homestead's vulnerabilities. The property was too large for one person to effectively patrol, with several approaches that could provide cover for intruders. The cabin itself was reasonably defensible, with thick log walls and few windows, but the barn and outbuildings were more exposed. They returned to find Rebecca already back from town, unloading supplies from her wagon. Thomas noted with concern that her expression was tighter than when she'd left, a subtle tension around her mouth and eyes that hadn't been there before. Everything all right in town? He asked, helping her lift a heavy sack of flour. Fine, she replied tersely, then, seeing James watching, softened her tone. Just the usual gossip and stares. Nothing important. But later, when James was occupied collecting eggs from the chicken coop, she pulled Thomas aside, her voice low and urgent. Churchill's men were all over town, making it clear to everyone that this property will be changing hands on Saturday. They're spreading rumors that I've been refusing reasonable offers out of spite rather than genuine attachment to the land. Her hands clenched at her sides, and the banker, Davis, was openly discussing plans for improvements once the Churchill Ranch incorporates our acreage. Thomas studied her face, noting the flush of anger on her cheeks and the determined set of her jaw. They're trying to isolate you, make the town see you as unreasonable so no one will object when they take action. It's working, Rebecca admitted, frustration evident in her voice. Even Riley at the blacksmith shop, who's been friendly since we arrived, suggested I should think of the boy and take Churchill's money. And the sheriff. Conveniently out of town until tomorrow. Supposedly investigating cattle theft near the territorial border, her voice was bitter, convenient timing. Thomas nodded unsurprised. It was a familiar pattern in frontier disputes, create a narrative that justified the stronger party's actions, ensure law enforcement was indisposed when needed, then act with enough force to succeed but not enough to attract territorial authorities' attention. Did you learn anything else while in town? Any reason Churchill is so fixed on this particular property? Rebecca hesitated. Nothing concrete, but there's a rumor that a geological survey team was through here last month. Something about the railroad wanting to assess possible routes. Thomas's interest sharpened. That would explain his increased pressure, if the railroad is seriously considering a route through this valley. The value of the land would increase tenfold, Rebecca finished for him, but why not just tell me that? Offer a fair price based on the potential value. Because men like Churchill don't believe in fair prices, Thomas replied. They believe in taking what they want for as little as possible. And right now, he thinks he's on the verge of taking your land for nothing more than legal fees at the land office. Rebecca's shoulders straightened, determination replacing frustration in her expression. Well, he's mistaken. I have no intention of surrendering this land, not for his current offer, and not for 10 times that amount. Thomas found himself admiring her spirit, even as he worried about the practical reality of their situation. Without legal documentation of her claim, and with Churchill's influence over local authorities, their options were limited and time was running short. We need leverage, he said thoughtfully. Something Churchill wants or fears enough to make him back off. The only thing Edward Churchill cares about is money and power, Rebecca replied, and we have neither. Thomas wasn't so certain. In his experience, even the most ruthless men had vulnerabilities, pride, reputation, secrets they wanted kept. The key was identifying them and finding a way to exploit them without crossing the line into criminality. I think, he said slowly, it's time I paid a visit to the Churchill Ranch, see what I can learn directly from the source. Rebecca's eyes widened. That's too dangerous. His men know you're helping me now. Exactly, Thomas countered. So it won't seem strange if I approach them claiming to have reconsidered my position. Men like Churchill always believe loyalty can be bought for the right price. And if he doesn't believe your change of heart? Thomas gave her a grim smile. Then I'll have confirmed he's as smart as he is ruthless, and we'll need another plan. Rebecca studied him for a long moment, her expression troubled. I don't want you risking yourself this way, Thomas. This isn't your fight. I made it mine when I stepped in yesterday, he replied simply. Then, seeing her continued concern, added, I've done riskier things for lesser causes. Trust me. Something in his tone or expression must have convinced her, because Rebecca finally nodded. Be careful, she said quietly. James would be terribly disappointed if his new hero didn't return. The casual reference to himself as the boy's hero caught Thomas off guard, stirring something long dormant in his chest. He had been many things in his years of wandering, hired gun, cowboy, bounty hunter, but never someone's hero. The responsibility of it weighed strangely, both burden and privilege. I'll be back before dark, he promised. Lock the doors while I'm gone and keep your shotgun handy, just in case. As Thomas rode toward the Churchill Ranch, following directions Rebecca had provided, he found himself reflecting on how quickly he had become entangled in the Adler's struggle. 3 days ago, he had been a drifter with no attachments and no responsibilities beyond his own survival. Now he was planning to confront one of the most powerful men in the county on behalf of a widow and child he barely knew. The sensible part of him, the part that had kept him alive through war and the violent years that followed, insisted this was foolishness. Attachment was weakness, involvement was risk, caring was vulnerability. Yet he could not deny the sense of purpose that had awakened in him since meeting Rebecca and James. For the first time in years, his actions felt meaningful rather than merely expedient. The Churchill Ranch came into view as he crested a hill, a sprawling operation with a large main house, bunkhouse, stables, and numerous outbuildings. Fenced pastures stretched in every direction, dotted with cattle. It was an impressive display of wealth and power, particularly for a territory still in its developmental stages. Thomas approached openly, making no attempt to conceal his presence. 2 ranch hands spotted him as he neared the main compound, one immediately riding off toward the house while the other moved to intercept him, rifle resting casually across his saddle. That's far enough, stranger, the man called when Thomas was within speaking distance. State your business. Name's Thomas Steele, he replied evenly. I'd like to speak with Mr. Churchill if he's available. The ranch hand's eyes narrowed in recognition. You're the widow's hired gun. I was, Thomas corrected. Circumstances have changed. Figured it would be neighborly to discuss the situation directly with Mr. Churchill. The man studied him suspiciously but eventually nodded. Wait here. Thomas remained mounted, seemingly relaxed but acutely aware of his surroundings, the positions of the various buildings, the number of men visible working in the yard, the distance to the nearest cover should things go badly. It was second nature after years of living in environments where threats could emerge from any quarter. After several minutes, the ranch hand returned, accompanied by Garrett, the foreman Thomas had met that morning. Steele, Garrett acknowledged, his expression guarded. This is an unexpected visit. Had some time to consider my position, Thomas replied with calculated casualness. Thought it might be worth discussing alternatives with your employer. Garrett and the other man exchanged glances. Mr. Churchill is a busy man, the foreman said finally. But given the circumstances, I expect he can spare a few minutes. Follow me, but you'll need to leave your weapons here. Thomas had anticipated this requirement. Slowly he unholstered his revolver and handed it but first to the ranch hand, then lifted his trouser leg to remove a smaller pistol from an ankle holster. The hidden weapon raised Garrett's eyebrows, but he merely nodded in approval of Thomas's cooperation. Smart man, the foreman commented as he led Thomas toward the main house. Coming armed to this ranch would be unwise. Never travel unarmed in Montana territory, Thomas replied with a shrug. Just good sense. The Churchill Ranch house was the largest private residence Thomas had seen since leaving Missouri, a two-story structure built of dressed lumber rather than logs, with glass windows and a wide porch wrapping around three sides. Inside, the furnishings were surprisingly refined for a frontier home, with imported carpets, upholstered furniture, and oil paintings in gilt frames. It was a deliberate display of wealth, designed to impress visitors with Churchill's success and influence. Garrett led Thomas to a study at the rear of the house, knocking once before opening the door. Mr. Churchill, Thomas Steele to see you, sir. Edward Churchill rose from behind a large oak desk, setting aside papers he had been reviewing. He was older than Thomas had expected, perhaps in his late 50s, with silver hair and a neatly trimmed beard. His clothing was Eastern in style, a well-tailored suit rather than the practical attire of most ranchers. Only his hands, large and calloused despite their current cleanliness, betrayed his frontier origins. Mr. Steele, Churchill said, his voice cultured but with an underlying hardness, I must say I'm surprised by your visit. Garrett tells me you were quite decisive in your support of Mrs. Adler this morning. Thomas inclined his head slightly. Circumstances change, Mr. Churchill. Initial impressions can be misleading. Churchill studied him for a long moment, then gestured to a chair across from his desk. Please sit, Garrett, that will be all for now. The foreman hesitated, clearly reluctant to leave his employer alone with an unknown quantity like Thomas. Churchill noticed and smiled thinly. Mr. Steele is unarmed, and I am not, he said, opening a desk drawer just enough to reveal a revolver within easy reach. We'll be fine. Once they were alone, Churchill leaned back in his chair, regarding Thomas with the calculated assessment of a man accustomed to measuring others' usefulness and price. So, Mr. Steele, what circumstances have changed since this morning? Thomas met his gaze steadily. I've had time to assess the situation more realistically. Mrs. Adler's position is untenable, legally and practically. My sympathy for her situation led me to offer assistance without fully understanding the facts. I see, Churchill's tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced, and now that you understand the facts, you've what? Come to offer your services to me instead, or perhaps to negotiate a better settlement for the widow. I'm a practical man, Thomas replied. I recognize when a situation is unsalvageable, Mrs. Adler is determined to fight for land that, without proper documentation, she cannot legally hold. That determination will likely lead to her losing everything, possibly including her freedom if things escalate to property destruction or violence. Churchill's expression remained impassive, but Thomas noted a slight relaxation in his posture, the subtle confidence of a man who believes he's gaining the upper hand. You seem to have developed quite an understanding of the situation in a very short time, Mr. Steele. I've seen similar disputes before, Thomas said with deliberate vagueness. They rarely end well for the weaker party, regardless of moral rights or wrongs. Churchill steepled his fingers, studying Thomas over them. And what exactly are you proposing? I believe, Mrs. Adler might be persuaded to accept a reasonable settlement if it were presented properly, as a compassionate gesture rather than a victory. $1,000 instead of $700. Perhaps with the provision that she and her son can remain in the cabin until the end of harvest season. That's quite generous, Churchill observed, his tone suggesting the opposite. Why would I increase my offer when I'll legally own the property by Saturday? Thomas leaned forward slightly. Because legal ownership and peaceful possession are different matters, Mrs. Adler is well liked in the community. Her husband was a Union veteran. Forcing a widow and child from their home, even legally, could damage your standing with certain elements in the territory, particularly if the situation turns ugly. Are you threatening me, Mr. Steele? Churchill's voice remained even, but his eyes had hardened. Not at all, Thomas replied calmly. I'm offering to help facilitate a resolution that benefits everyone, Mrs. Adler gets fair compensation and time to relocate. You get the land without public sympathy turning against you. I get the satisfaction of preventing potential bloodshed. Churchill rose and moved to a sideboard, pouring 2 glasses of whiskey. He offered one to Thomas, who accepted it with a nod of thanks. You present yourself as quite the diplomat, Mr. Steele, yet Garrett tells me you carry yourself like a man familiar with violence. Churchill returned to his seat, sipping his whiskey. I wonder which is the true nature. Both, Thomas answered honestly. I've seen enough fighting to know it's usually the last resort of men who have run out of better ideas. This response seemed to amuse Churchill. Well said, he set his glass down, his expression becoming more calculating. However, your concern for public opinion presupposes that I value it highly. The reality of the frontier is that power speaks louder than sentiment. The railroad is coming to this valley, Mr. Steele. Those who control land along its route will prosper beyond imagination. A few disapproving glances from townspeople who need my business to survive are hardly worth considering. Thomas noted the confirmation of the railroad rumors, but kept his expression neutral. The railroad brings more than commerce, Mr. Churchill. It brings territorial officials, federal marshals, investors, people who might take an interest in how property changes hands in developing regions. For the first time, a flicker of genuine annoyance crossed Churchill's face. You seem remarkably well informed for a drifting cowboy. I listen, Thomas replied simply, and I've worked for men on both sides of such developments. Churchill studied him silently for a moment, reassessing. Let's be direct, Mr. Steele. What is your actual interest here? You're clearly not the sentimental type, rushing to a widow's defense out of pure chivalry. What do you want? A percentage, Thomas said, delivering the lie with practiced ease. Of the increased settlement amount. Call it a finder's fee for facilitating a solution that avoids complications. Churchill laughed, a short, harsh sound with little humor. Now we reach the truth. Every man has his price, after all. He leaned forward, eyes suddenly keen. But I wonder if Mrs. Adler could afford to pay you more than I'm offering, would you still be sitting in my study? The question was a trap, designed to test Thomas's claimed mercenary nature. Mrs. Adler can barely afford to feed her son, let alone hire a gunman at competitive rates, he replied carefully. I offered help initially out of sympathy, but sympathy doesn't fill a stomach or buy ammunition. Churchill seemed satisfied with this answer, nodding slightly. Very pragmatic, I can respect that. He drummed his fingers on the desk, considering. I'll offer $800 with 60 days for Mrs. Adler to vacate the property. You receive $100 for your diplomatic services, provided she accepts without further resistance. $900 for Mrs. Adler, Thomas countered automatically, playing the role of negotiator. The extra 100 means nothing to an operation of your size, but it could make a significant difference for a woman starting over with a young child. Churchill's mouth twitched with what might have been grudging respect. $900 then, with your fee remaining at $100. I'll have papers drawn up tomorrow. He rose, indicating the meeting was concluded. I assume you can convince Mrs. Adler of the wisdom of accepting this generous offer. Thomas stood as well. I believe I can present the situation in a way she'll understand. Excellent, Churchill extended his hand, his grip firm when Thomas shook it. I appreciate pragmatism, Mr. Steele. Too many men in this territory are guided by emotion rather than reason. It's refreshing to deal with someone who recognizes reality. As Garrett escorted Thomas back to his horse and returned his weapons, Thomas maintained the facade of satisfaction with their arrangement. Only when he was riding away from the Churchill ranch, certain he was unobserved, did he allow his expression to harden into determination rather than complicity. Edward Churchill had revealed more than he realized during their conversation. His casual confirmation of the railroad's planned arrival and his dismissal of legal niceties suggested a man accustomed to operating above conventional constraints. More importantly, his confidence bordered on arrogance. He had accepted Thomas's supposed change of allegiance with minimal skepticism, convinced that everyone had a price. That arrogance might prove useful, but first, Thomas needed to share what he'd learned with Rebecca and formulate a plan. They had less than 3 days before Churchill expected to take legal possession of the Adler homestead, and Thomas was increasingly convinced the rancher would not hesitate to use force if his legal maneuvers failed. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across the valley, Thomas urged Rusty to a faster pace. Time was running short, and he had promised to return before dark. The thought of that promise, and of the woman and child waiting for him to keep it, stirred something long dormant in his chest. For the first time in years, someone was counting on him for more than hired skills. The weight of that trust was both unfamiliar and strangely satisfying. Rebecca was waiting on the porch when Thomas returned, the fading light of sunset casting long shadows across the yard. She rose as he dismounted, her expression a mixture of relief and anxious anticipation. "You're back," she said simply. "Told you I would be." Thomas led Rusty toward the barn, Rebecca falling into step beside him. "And what happened?" Thomas glanced toward the cabin. "Where's James?" "Already asleep. He exhausted himself helping me repair chicken coops all afternoon." A small smile touched her lips. "He was determined to stay awake until you returned, but lost the battle about an hour ago." Thomas nodded, relieved they could speak freely. As they reached the barn, he took care of Rusty's needs first, removing saddle and bridle, providing fresh water and hay, before sharing what he had learned. Rebecca listened intently, leaning against a stall partition with her arms crossed. "So the railroad rumors are true," she said when he had finished. "That explains Churchill's persistence." "And his confidence." "Yes," Thomas agreed, wiping down his saddle with a cloth. "He believes he's already won, that by Saturday, the property will legally be his regardless of any moral objections." Rebecca's expression hardened. "And you let him believe you'd help convince me to accept his offer." "It seemed the safest approach," Thomas replied, meeting her eyes directly. "I needed information more than I needed to declare loyalty to your cause." After a moment, she nodded, accepting his reasoning. "And did you get useful information, beyond confirming the railroad plans?" Thomas set aside the saddle and turned to face her fully. "I learned that Churchill is arrogant enough to believe everyone has a price. That he's concerned about territorial officials taking an interest in his land acquisitions, and that he'll use force if necessary, but would prefer to appear magnanimous in public view. None of that helps us prevent him from taking legal possession on Saturday," Rebecca pointed out, frustration evident in her voice. "Without the marriage certificate or Daniel's death record, I have no legal proof of my right to inherit the homestead claim." "True," Thomas acknowledged, "but there might be another approach. Churchill is focused on securing this land before the railroad plans become public knowledge. What if those plans were to become known prematurely?" Rebecca frowned, considering this. "How would that help us?" "It would only increase the value of the land, making Churchill even more determined to acquire it. It would also attract attention from territorial authorities and possibly railroad officials themselves," Thomas explained. "Churchill clearly wants to avoid outside scrutiny of his methods. If word spreads about valuable railroad land being seized from a widow under questionable circumstances." Understanding dawned in Rebecca's eyes. It could force him to proceed more cautiously, perhaps even legitimately. She pushed away from the stall partition, pacing a few steps as she thought, "But how would we spread such news?" "Churchill controls most of the influential people in town." "Not all of them," Thomas replied. The church minister seemed independent-minded when I observed him yesterday, the schoolteacher as well. And there must be others who resent Churchill's dominance, but have stayed quiet out of self-preservation. Rebecca nodded slowly. Reverend Parker has been kind to us. And Miss Holloway, the teacher, was a friend to Daniel. She paused, considering. But even if we convince them, how do we prove the railroad plans are real? Churchill would simply deny everything. Thomas smiled slightly. We don't need to prove it. We just need to create enough doubt and public interest that Churchill can't act without attracting unwanted attention. For the first time since he'd returned, hope flickered in Rebecca's expression. A delay could give us time for my father's letter to arrive with the documents we need. Exactly. Rebecca moved closer, her green eyes searching his face. Why are you doing this, Thomas, truly? You could have taken Churchill's money today and been on your way with no one the wiser. The directness of her question caught him off guard, though he should have expected it. Rebecca Adler was not a woman who shied away from uncomfortable truths. I told you, he said, turning back to his tack to avoid her perceptive gaze. Sometimes doing the right thing is the only way to remember who you are. And who are you, Thomas Steele? Her voice was softer now, but no less direct. Because I don't believe you're the drifting gunman, with no attachments that you present to the world. Thomas's hands stilled on the bridle he was hanging. For a moment, he considered deflecting with his usual vague responses or changing the subject entirely. But something about the quiet intensity of her question deserved honesty. I don't know anymore, he admitted, still not turning. After the war, I became someone else, someone harder, safer. He drew a deep breath. It was necessary for survival, but lately I've wondered if that person is all that's left. He hadn't intended to reveal so much, and the silence that followed his words was heavy with unspoken understanding. Then he felt a light touch on his arm, Rebecca's hand, gentle but firm, turning him to face her. I understand more than you might think, she said quietly. The frontier changes us all. Forces compromises we never thought we'd make. Her eyes held his, unwavering. But I see glimpses of the man beneath the armor, Thomas, in how you talk to James, in your instinct to help strangers against your own interest. That man is still there. Thomas found himself unable to look away from her gaze, so direct and yet so compassionate. In that moment, he realized how long it had been since anyone had truly seen him, not the capable gunman or the reliable ranch hand, but the person beneath those useful exteriors. Maybe, he conceded finally, but I'm not sure he's someone worth knowing anymore. Rebecca's hand remained on his arm, her touch warm through the fabric of his shirt. I think he is, she said simply. Then, as if recognizing the sudden intimacy of the moment, she stepped back, her manner becoming practical again. We should discuss our plan for tomorrow. If we're going to start spreading word about the railroad, we need to be strategic. Thomas nodded, both relieved and oddly disappointed by the return to business. We'll need to be careful, he cautioned. Direct accusations against Churchill would backfire. Better to approach it as concerned citizens sharing rumors they've heard. They spent the next hour developing their strategy, sitting on hay bales in the barn's lantern light. Rebecca would visit her friends in town, the teacher, the minister, and several farm wives she trusted, ostensibly to purchase final supplies before the Saturday deadline. During these visits, she would casually mention rumors of railroad developments and express concern about local land changing hands just before such valuable news became public. Thomas, meanwhile, would make a similar circuit among the men, the blacksmith, the barber, the saloon keeper, places where masculine gossip flourished and could spread quickly. They would be careful to present the information as speculation rather than accusation, allowing the natural human tendency toward suspicion to do the rest. It's not a permanent solution, Thomas warned as they finished planning. At best, it buys us time, perhaps enough for your father's documents to arrive. Time is all we need, Rebecca replied with quiet determination. Once I have legal proof of my right to the homestead, even Churchill can't simply take it without consequences. As they walked from the barn to the cabin, the night sky spread vast and star-filled above them. Thomas found himself acutely aware of Rebecca beside him, her quiet strength, her intelligence, her unwavering commitment to preserving her son's inheritance. In the 3 days since he'd met her, his admiration had grown with each revelation of her character. At the cabin door, Rebecca paused, turning to face him. Thank you, she said softly, not just for the plan, but for believing this fight is worthwhile. Most men would have advised me to take the money and start over somewhere else. Most men haven't seen what happens to those who surrender too easily, Thomas replied. This land is worth fighting for, not just for its value, but for what it represents. Rebecca studied him in the moonlight, her expression thoughtful. You understand, don't you, that it's not just about the acres or the cabin. It's about James having roots, a history, something that can't be taken away by the next powerful man who decides he wants it. Yes, the simplicity of his answer seemed to satisfy her. Good night, Thomas, she said, her hand briefly touching his arm again before she turned and entered the cabin. Thomas remained on the porch for a long moment after the door closed, listening to the night sounds of the homestead, the soft lowing of cattle in the barn, the whisper of wind through corn stalks, the distant call of a coyote. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of purpose beyond mere survival, a connection to something larger than his own solitary existence. It was dangerous, this feeling. Attachment made you vulnerable, connection exposed weaknesses that could be exploited. Yet as Thomas finally turned toward the barn where his bedroll awaited, he couldn't entirely regret the warm weight settling in his chest, the unfamiliar but undeniable sense of belonging. The next morning dawned clear and warm, the kind of perfect late summer day that made the harsh Montana winters seem like distant fantasy. Thomas rose early, completing his morning ablutions at the creek before Rebecca and James stirred. By the time they emerged from the cabin, he had already fed the livestock and was repairing a broken hinge on the chicken coop. You're up with the sun, Rebecca observed, carrying a basket of eggs she'd just collected. She wore a simple calico dress, her hair neatly braided and pinned up, presenting a more polished appearance than her usual practical work attire. Old habit, Thomas replied, noting her changed appearance. You look ready for town. She nodded. I thought I'd head in early, make my rounds before the heat of the day. Good idea. I'll follow in an hour or so, take a different route. Better if we're not seen together too much today. James emerged from feeding the chickens, his face lighting up at the sight of Thomas. Are you going to teach me to ride today, Mr. Steele? You promised yesterday. Thomas glanced at Rebecca, who gave a small nod of permission. Later this afternoon, he told the boy, after your mama and I get back from town. This compromise satisfied James, who immediately launched into a detailed description of how his father had begun teaching him on their old mule before he went to heaven. Thomas listened patiently, struck once again by the boy's resilience, his ability to speak of his father with wistful joy rather than overwhelming sorrow. Children, he reflected, often showed more wisdom in facing loss than adults did. After breakfast, Rebecca prepared to leave for town, loading her wagon with empty sacks and containers to justify her shopping trip. As she climbed onto the seat, she gave Thomas a look of mingled determination and apprehension. Remember, he said quietly, standing beside the wagon, casual mentions, not direct accusations, and be careful. Churchill may have people watching you. I know, she replied, gathering the reins. You be careful too. His men know you met with him yesterday. They may expect you to be working for their side now. Thomas nodded, stepping back as she clicked to the mule. Watching the wagon disappear down the track toward town, he felt a twinge of unease. Their plan was sound in theory, but it relied on people's willingness to question a powerful man like Churchill, something frontier communities often discouraged for the sake of stability. An hour later, Thomas saddled Rusty and followed, taking a more circuitous route that would bring him into Whitetail Creek from the north, as if he were arriving from another destination entirely. As he rode, he rehearsed his approach, planning how to introduce the railroad rumors naturally into conversation without appearing to have an agenda. The town was bustling with its usual weekday activity when Thomas arrived, wagons loaded with supplies, ranch hands picking up mail or enjoying rare time away from their duties, shopkeepers sweeping boardwalks or arranging displays. Thomas tied Rusty outside the blacksmith's shop, his first planned stop on the circuit of local businesses. Riley the blacksmith was working at his forge, hammering a glowing piece of metal with practiced precision. He nodded in greeting as Thomas approached, but continued his work until he had cooled the shaped metal in a water barrel, sending up a cloud of hissing steam. Steele, he acknowledged finally, wiping sweat from his brow with a soot-stained forearm. Figured you might have moved on by now. Most drifters do. Found some work that interested me, Thomas replied casually, examining a row of horseshoes hanging on the wall. Always like to understand a place before deciding whether to stay or go. Riley grunted, returning to his bench where several more pieces awaited his attention. And what's your understanding of Whitetail Creek so far? Thomas shrugged, picking up a horseshoe and testing its weight. Seems like a town on the edge of something, not sure what yet. How's that? Riley's interest was piqued, just as Thomas had hoped. Just a feeling, been through enough frontier settlements to recognize the signs. Thomas set the horseshoe down and leaned against a support post. Survey teams coming through, land changing hands, folks with inside information positioning themselves. Riley's hands stilled on his tools. What survey teams? Heard some men talking at Churchill's ranch yesterday, Thomas said, the casual lie coming easily. Something about geological assessments for railroad planning, thought it was common knowledge. First I've heard of it, Riley muttered, but his expression had sharpened with interest. Though it would explain a few things. Oh, Thomas kept his tone merely curious. Churchill buying up every available acre he can get his hands on this past year, bringing in Eastern investors to expand his operations. Riley picked up a file and began sharpening a tool with more force than necessary. Makes a man wonder what he knows that the rest of us don't. Thomas nodded sympathetically, frontiers full of those stories. Big money gets advance word, ordinary folks left scrambling for crumbs afterward. Riley's expression darkened further. Ain't right, a man works his whole life to build something, then some corporation or cattle baron swoops in and takes it all because they knew which way the wind was blowing before anyone else. That's progress they call it, Thomas remarked, deliberately bitter. At least that's what the beneficiaries say. The conversation continued in this vein for several more minutes, with Thomas carefully nurturing Riley's nascent suspicion without appearing to have a personal stake in the matter. By the time he left the blacksmith shop, he was confident the older man would spread the rumor to his next several customers, presenting it as his own discovery rather than information fed to him by Thomas. Thomas continued his circuit of the town, stopping at the barbershop for a shave he didn't really need, lingering at the general store to purchase tobacco, and finally settling at the saloon for a midday drink. At each location, he carefully planted the seed of the railroad rumors, always presenting the information as something overheard or casually observed rather than deliberately shared. By early afternoon, he could already see the effects of their strategy. Men gathered in small groups on the boardwalk, conversations halting when certain individuals passed by. The banker Davis emerged from his building looking distinctly agitated, immediately heading toward the telegraph office with a sealed envelope in hand. Most tellingly, two of Churchill's ranch hands who had been loitering near the general store suddenly mounted up and rode out of town, presumably to report these new developments to their employer. Thomas was nursing a second whiskey at the saloon, listening to the increasingly elaborate speculations at the bar, when the door swung open and Rebecca entered. Her appearance in the predominantly male establishment caused a momentary lull in conversation before the barkeeper called out a greeting. "Mrs. Adler, what can I do for you today?" Rebecca nodded politely, ignoring the stares of the other patrons. "I need to speak with Mr. Steele if he's available." Her gaze found Thomas at his corner table, her expression controlled, but with an urgency that immediately put him on alert. Thomas stood, leaving payment for his drinks on the table. "Mrs. Adler," he acknowledged, gesturing toward the door. "Shall we step outside?" Once they were on the boardwalk, away from curious ears, Rebecca spoke in a low, tense voice. "Churchill's men stopped me as I was leaving the mercantile, said their employer wants to see us both, immediately." Thomas frowned, glancing down the street where one of Churchill's riders was indeed waiting, watching them with undisguised impatience. "Did they say why?" "No, but they made it clear refusal wasn't an option." Rebecca's hands were steady, but Thomas could see the tension in her shoulders. "I told them I needed to find you first." Thomas considered their options. The rumors were clearly spreading faster and having a greater impact than they'd anticipated. Churchill's sudden summons suggested he suspected their involvement and wanted to address the situation before it escalated further. "We'll go," he decided. Better to face him directly than give him reason to come to the homestead in force. Rebecca nodded, though concern still shadowed her eyes. "James is with Miss Holloway at the schoolhouse. I arranged for him to stay there until I return." Thomas appreciated her foresight. Whatever confrontation awaited them at the Churchill Ranch, it was better that James be safely elsewhere. They collected their respective mounts, Rusty from the hitching post and Rebecca's mule from where she'd left it at the livery stable, then followed Churchill's messenger out of town. Neither spoke much during the ride, each occupied with their own thoughts and preparations for the coming encounter. The Churchill Ranch appeared much as it had the day before, but with a noticeable increase in activity. Men moved purposefully between buildings, several carrying rifles, while others loaded supplies into wagons. It had the atmosphere of preparation, though whether for defense or offense, Thomas couldn't immediately determine. They were led directly to the main house, where Garrett met them on the porch. "Mr. Churchill is waiting in his study," the foreman said curtly, his previous professional demeanor replaced with barely concealed hostility. "This way." As they followed him through the house, Thomas positioned himself slightly ahead of Rebecca, a subtle protective gesture that didn't escape her notice. She touched his arm briefly in acknowledgement, her fingers warm against his sleeve before withdrawing. Churchill rose from behind his desk as they entered, his expression controlled but with anger simmering beneath the surface. Unlike the day before, he did not offer them seats or refreshments. "Mrs. Adler, Mr. Steele," his voice was cold, precise. "I find myself curious about the sudden flood of railroad speculation in town today, particularly since it seems to have originated shortly after my meeting with Mr. Steele yesterday." Thomas met his gaze steadily. "Can't say I've heard much speculation myself, Mr. Churchill. I've been focused on helping Mrs. Adler prepare for Saturday's deadline." Churchill's mouth tightened. "Let's dispense with the pretense, shall we? You came to my home, presented yourself as a man willing to persuade Mrs. Adler to sell, then immediately began spreading rumors designed to complicate my acquisition of her property. If people are talking about railroads and land values, perhaps it's because they've noticed your pattern of acquisitions," Rebecca interjected, her chin lifting slightly. "Concerned citizens often share observations." Churchill's gaze shifted to her, his expression hardening further. "I've been patient with you, Mrs. Adler, out of respect for your late husband and your situation." "That patience has limits." "As does mine, Mr. Churchill," Rebecca replied evenly. "You've attempted to intimidate me, damage my property, and steal my son's inheritance through legal technicalities. Yet I'm the one being accused of inappropriate behavior for simply discussing public matters with my neighbors." Thomas suppressed a smile at her spirited response. Rebecca Adler was not a woman easily cowed, even when facing one of the most powerful men in the territory. Churchill's composure slipped momentarily, a flash of genuine anger crossing his features before he controlled it. "I had hoped we could resolve this situation amicably." "It seems that won't be possible." He turned his attention back to Thomas. "And you, Mr. Steele, you've made a serious mistake in your choice of allies." "I've made my share of mistakes," Thomas acknowledged calmly. "Standing against bullies has never been one of them." The studied insult hit its mark. Churchill's face flushed, and he moved around the desk until he stood directly before them. "Let me be perfectly clear. By Saturday noon, the bank will process my claim to the Adler property, with or without Mrs. Adler's cooperation. No amount of gossip or speculation will prevent that." "Perhaps not," Thomas agreed. "But it might interest territorial officials enough to examine exactly how you've acquired so much land in such a short time. I understand they take a dim view of manipulated property transfers, particularly when they involve war widows." "Is that a threat, Mr. Steele?" "Just an observation. Concerned citizens often share those." For a moment, the tension in the room was palpable, a dangerous current running between the two men. Then Churchill stepped back, his expression cooling into calculated menace. "You've made your position clear," he said quietly. "Now let me make mine equally clear. Mrs. Adler will vacate that property by Saturday noon, one way or another. The only question is whether she leaves with compensation or with nothing but the clothes on her back." Rebecca's hand found Thomas's arm, her grip tight but steady. "We're finished here," she said, addressing Churchill with remarkable composure. "Any further communication can be directed through the sheriff or territorial authorities." As they turned to leave, Churchill added, "One final point, Mrs. Adler. I would keep a close eye on your son in the coming days. The frontier can be so dangerous for children. Accidents happen with tragic frequency. Thomas felt Rebecca stiffen beside him, her face paling at the thinly veiled threat. Before he could respond, she whirled back to face Churchill, her green eyes blazing. If anything happens to my son, Mr. Churchill, there is nowhere in this territory you could hide from me. That is not a threat. It is a promise from a mother who has already lost enough. The raw conviction in her voice seemed to momentarily startle Churchill. He blinked, then inclined his head slightly. I merely offered friendly advice about frontier dangers, Mrs. Adler, nothing more. Thomas placed his hand at the small of Rebecca's back, gently guiding her toward the door before the situation escalated further. We'll be going now, he said, his voice deliberately neutral despite the cold fury building in his chest at Churchill's implied threat against James. Garrett escorted them back outside, where their horses waited. Neither Thomas nor Rebecca spoke until they had ridden well beyond the ranch's boundaries, out of earshot of any potential observers. He threatened James, Rebecca said finally, her voice tight with controlled rage and fear. My 5-year-old son. He was trying to frighten you, Thomas replied, though the same cold anger burned in his own veins. Men like Churchill use whatever leverage they can find. Well, he succeeded, she admitted, her hands white-knuckled on her reins. I'm frightened, Thomas, not for myself but for James. Churchill clearly believes he has nothing to lose now. Thomas reached across the space between them, briefly covering her hand with his own. We won't let anything happen to James. I promise you that. Rebecca nodded, drawing a deep breath to steady herself. Our plan seems to have worked too well. We wanted to create doubt and discussion, not push Churchill into desperate measures. We've forced his hand, Thomas agreed grimly. He'll move more quickly now, before the rumors can spread further or attract outside attention. What do we do? Thomas considered their options, none of which seemed particularly promising. We get James and return to the homestead. Fortify it as best we can, and hope that the public attention we've generated provides some protection against Churchill's more extreme options. Rebecca nodded again, squaring her shoulders with the determination that had first drawn Thomas's admiration. Then let's collect my son and prepare for whatever comes. As they rode toward town to retrieve James from the schoolhouse, Thomas found himself acutely aware of his growing attachment to both Rebecca and her son. In less than a week, they had somehow bypassed the careful barriers he had maintained for years, becoming people he cared about rather than merely a cause he supported. It was dangerous, this feeling of connection, this sense of responsibility that went beyond professional obligation. Yet as he glanced at Rebecca riding beside him, her face set in lines of worried determination, Thomas knew he had crossed a threshold from which there was no returning. Whatever happened in the coming days, their fates were now inextricably linked in ways he couldn't yet fully comprehend. James was delighted to see them when they arrived at the schoolhouse, proudly showing Thomas the sums he had worked on with Miss Holloway's guidance. The boy's innocent enthusiasm provided a sharp contrast to the tension Thomas and Rebecca carried from their confrontation with Churchill, a reminder of exactly what was at stake in their struggle. As they prepared to leave, Miss Holloway drew Rebecca aside for a private word, while Thomas helped James mount the wagon. The young teacher's concerned expression and earnest gestures suggested she was sharing information of some importance. Rebecca listened intently, her face growing more serious before she finally nodded and rejoined Thomas and James. What was that about? Thomas asked quietly as they started back toward the homestead, James happily sandwiched between them on the wagon seat. Sarah, Miss Holloway says there's been talk in town all day about the railroad and Churchill's land purchases, Rebecca replied in an equally low voice. The banker, Davis, sent an urgent telegram to someone in Helena. And the sheriff returned early from his supposed investigation. Thomas frowned. That suggests Churchill is calling in reinforcements, or preparing legal justification for whatever he's planning next. Rebecca nodded, careful to keep her expression neutral for James's benefit. Sarah also said several of Churchill's men were asking about you specifically, your background, how long you've been in the territory. They seemed particularly interested in whether you've had any conflicts with the law. This information didn't surprise Thomas. Men like Churchill often sought leverage through past mistakes or legal vulnerabilities. Fortunately, despite his occasional work on the edges of frontier law, Thomas had been careful to maintain a clean official record. "Let them ask," he said with a shrug. "There's nothing to find that would help them." Rebecca studied his profile for a moment. "Are you certain?" "We all have pasts, Thomas, things we'd rather not become public." The question hung between them, not an accusation, but a practical concern from a woman who needed to know exactly what weaknesses their opponent might exploit. Thomas appreciated her directness, even as he considered how much to reveal. "Nothing that would interest Churchill or the law," he answered finally. "I've done things I'm not proud of, but nothing that would give them legal grounds against me." Rebecca seemed satisfied with this response, turning her attention back to the road ahead. James, oblivious to the undercurrents of adult conversation, chattered about his day at school and his excitement for the promised riding lesson. They reached the homestead by mid-afternoon, the peaceful appearance of the property standing in stark contrast to the conflict brewing around it. As James ran to check on his chickens, Thomas and Rebecca conferred quietly by the wagon. "We should prepare for tonight," Thomas said, helping her unload the supplies she'd purchased in town. "Churchill might decide speed is better than subtlety at this point." Rebecca nodded grimly. "What do you suggest?" "Board up the lower windows of the cabin. Move essential supplies inside. Keep the livestock in the barn rather than the pasture." Thomas glanced toward the tree line that bordered the property, and establish watch positions with clear lines of sight in all directions. "You think they'll come tonight?" Rebecca's voice was steady, but Thomas could see the concern in her eyes. "I think we should be prepared regardless," he replied. Churchill was angry, and angry men often act impulsively. They spent the remainder of the afternoon implementing Thomas's security measures, involving James in simple tasks to keep him occupied without frightening him. The boy seemed to view the whole process as an exciting game, particularly when Thomas showed him how to create alarm systems with tin cans on strings at potential approach points. As dusk approached, Rebecca prepared a hearty meal, partly to maintain normalcy for James's sake, and partly because, as she quietly told Thomas, men fight better on full stomachs. The simple domestic scene, Rebecca cooking, James setting the table, Thomas coming in from final checks of the property, carried a poignancy that wasn't lost on any of them. It was a moment of peace before an uncertain night. After dinner, as Rebecca prepared James for bed, Thomas made a final circuit of the homestead's perimeter. The night was clear and still, stars emerging in a velvet sky unmarred by clouds. A perfect night for an approach, with enough moonlight to guide movement but sufficient shadows to provide cover. If Churchill intended to act, these conditions would favor him. When Thomas returned to the cabin, he found Rebecca sitting at the table, cleaning her husband's old army revolver with practiced movements. James was already asleep in the curtained sleeping area, his soft breathing audible in the quiet room. "Daniel taught me to use this before James was even born," she said without looking up. "Said a woman alone on the frontier should never be defenseless." Her hands moved confidently over the weapon, checking the cylinder in action. "I never thought I'd actually need to use it." Thomas sat across from her, watching her capable hands. "With luck, you still won't have to." Rebecca set the revolver down, finally meeting his eyes. "If they come tonight, what are our chances?" He considered lying, offering false comfort, but quickly dismissed the idea. Rebecca deserved honesty, not platitudes. Depends on how many men Churchill sends and what their orders are. "If they're just here to frighten you, to force a sale through intimidation, our chances are good. If they're here to remove you by any means necessary," he left the implications unspoken. Rebecca nodded, accepting this assessment. "And what about you, Thomas? This isn't your fight. You could ride away, avoid whatever's coming." "Is that what you want me to do?" "No," she admitted softly, "but I need to know that you understand what you're risking. Churchill won't forget or forgive opposition." Thomas reached across the table, his hand covering hers where it rested beside the revolver. "I made my choice when I first spoke up in town. I'm staying, Rebecca." The use of her first name, something he had rarely done, seemed to emphasize the personal nature of his commitment. Rebecca turned her hand beneath his, their fingers interlacing briefly before she withdrew. "Then we should prepare," she said, rising from the table. "I'll take first watch if you'll take second. We both need some rest before morning." Thomas agreed to this arrangement, though he doubted either of them would sleep deeply given the circumstances. As Rebecca moved to check on James one last time, Thomas extinguished the lamps, leaving only the fireplace's dying embers to cast a warm glow through the cabin. From the doorway to the sleeping area, Rebecca paused, looking back at Thomas. In the soft firelight, with her hair loose around her shoulders and her expression unguarded, she appeared younger and more vulnerable than the determined homesteader he had come to know. "Thomas," she said quietly, "thank you, not just for staying, but for believing this place is worth fighting for, worth risking everything for." Before he could respond, she had slipped through the curtain to take up her watch position at the small window overlooking the approach to the cabin. Thomas stood for a moment in the dimly lit room, struck by the strange turns his life had taken in the past week. From solitary drifter to defender of a homestead, from casual observer to committed ally, from emotional isolation to whatever this growing feeling was that tightened his chest whenever he looked at Rebecca Adler. Shaking off these unsettling thoughts, Thomas moved to his own position by the front door, rifle ready as he prepared for the long night ahead. Whatever came with the dawn, he was exactly where he needed to be. The night passed in tense vigilance, but no attack materialized. Thomas and Rebecca traded watch duties every few hours, each getting some rest though neither slept deeply. By dawn, when James awoke with his usual childish energy, they were tired but relieved that Churchill had apparently decided against immediate action. "Perhaps our rumors had more effect than we thought," Rebecca suggested as they shared a breakfast of cornmeal mush and coffee. "If enough people are watching, Churchill might be reconsidering his more aggressive options." Thomas was less optimistic. "More likely, he's planning something more calculated than a night raid. Churchill strikes me as a man who prefers to maintain appearances when possible." The day progressed with an unusual combination of ordinary tasks and defensive preparations. Rebecca worked in her garden and tended to household chores, while Thomas repaired weak points in the cabin's structure and fashioned additional barricades that could be quickly deployed if needed. James alternated between helping them both, still viewing the entire situation as an exciting departure from routine rather than a potentially dangerous confrontation. By mid-morning, Thomas was repairing a section of fence when he noticed a single rider approaching from the direction of town. He straightened, hand moving instinctively to the revolver at his hip, but the figure soon resolved into the familiar form of the town's sheriff. Thomas called to Rebecca, who was hanging laundry nearby, then moved to meet the lawman at the edge of the property. Sheriff Wilson was a middle-aged man with a weathered face and the cautious demeanor of someone who had survived frontier law enforcement through prudence rather than bravery. He nodded in greeting as he reined in his horse. "Steele, Mrs. Adler," he acknowledged, tipping his hat to Rebecca as she joined them. "Thought I should ride out personally, given the situation." "What situation would that be, Sheriff?" Thomas asked, his tone neutral but watchful. Wilson sighed, removing his hat and wiping sweat from his brow. "Look, I'll be direct. There's talk all over town about railroad plans and land speculation. Churchill's furious, claiming you two are spreading malicious rumors to interfere with legitimate business transactions." "Is that a crime now, Sheriff?" Discussing public matters, Rebecca's voice was calm but carried a subtle edge. "No, ma'am, it is not." Wilson replaced his hat, his expression uncomfortable. "But tensions are rising, and I'd prefer to prevent trouble before it starts." "We'd prefer that too," Thomas replied. "Has Churchill filed any formal complaints?" The sheriff shook his head. "Not yet, but he's been in frequent communication with the bank and the Territorial Land Office. I expect matters will come to a head tomorrow, when the deadline for documentation arrives." Rebecca's shoulders straightened. "I have no intention of leaving my property, Sheriff Wilson, with or without papers from St. Louis." "I figured as much, ma'am." Wilson's gaze shifted to Thomas. "And you're determined to stand with Mrs. Adler in this?" "I am." The sheriff studied them both for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Then I should inform you that I received a telegraph from Helena this morning. A representative from the Territorial Land Office will be arriving on tomorrow's stage to review the disputed claim personally." This news surprised both Thomas and Rebecca. "Churchill's doing?" Thomas asked. "Actually, no," Wilson replied, a hint of satisfaction in his voice. "Seems your discussions about railroad interests attracted attention in the territorial capital. They're sending someone to ensure all property transfers in the area are being conducted properly." Rebecca's eyes widened with cautious hope. "Then there's a chance for a fair hearing." I'd say so, Mrs. Adler Wilson adjusted his position in the saddle, which is why I'm here to strongly suggest you both come into town for the night, stay at the hotel where I can keep an eye on things. Churchill's men have been drinking heavily since yesterday, making threats. I'd feel better having everyone where I can see them. Thomas exchanged a glance with Rebecca, silently conferring. The sheriff's suggestion had merit. The arrival of a territorial official changed the dynamic considerably, and staying in town would provide additional safety through visibility and witnesses. Yet leaving the homestead undefended meant risking damage to the property itself. I appreciate the offer, Sheriff, Rebecca said finally, but this is our home. We'll stay here tonight and come into town tomorrow morning for the official's arrival. Wilson frowned, clearly displeased with this decision. Mrs. Adler, I can't guarantee your safety out here. My jurisdiction covers the entire county, and I have limited deputies. We understand, Thomas interjected, but the property needs protection as much as we do. We'll be careful, and we'll be in town first thing tomorrow. The sheriff studied them both, recognizing the futility of further argument. Very well, but I strongly advise keeping a sharp lookout tonight. Churchill isn't a man who accepts defeat gracefully. After the sheriff departed, Thomas and Rebecca discussed this new development as they continued their work around the homestead. A territorial official changes everything, Rebecca said, hope evident in her voice for the first time in days. Even without my documentation, they might grant an extension while we wait for the papers from St. Louis. Thomas nodded, though he remained cautious. It's certainly better than facing only Churchill's influence, but we still need to be vigilant. This might make him more desperate, not less. As the day progressed, they maintained their careful preparations while trying to preserve some normalcy for James's sake. Thomas kept his promise to teach the boy basic riding skills, using Rebecca's gentle mule for the lessons. Watching James's face light up with pride as he mastered sitting properly in the saddle, Thomas felt an unexpected swell of emotion, pride mingled with a protective instinct that went beyond his commitment to helping Rebecca defend her property. In just a few days, the solemn-faced boy had worked his way into Thomas's carefully guarded heart, bringing with him glimpses of a life Thomas had long ago convinced himself was not meant for men like him. A life of connection, of teaching, of watching a child grow and learn rather than merely surviving from one job to the next. The afternoon shadows were lengthening when Thomas noticed a disturbance among the chickens near the coop, unusual agitation that suggested the presence of a predator or intruder. Telling James to return to Rebecca at the cabin, Thomas approached cautiously, rifle ready. He found nothing near the coop itself, but fresh boot prints in the soft earth behind it suggested someone had been there recently. Following the tracks, Thomas discovered they led toward the tree line at the property's edge, where they disappeared among pine needles and underbrush. Returning to the cabin, Thomas reported this finding to Rebecca while James was occupied with his lessons at the table. "Scouts," he said quietly, keeping his voice low enough that James wouldn't overhear. "Probably assessing our preparations, counting how many people are here." Rebecca's expression tightened with concern. "Do you think they'll attack tonight?" "Possibly," Thomas glanced toward James, then back to Rebecca. "I still think you should consider the sheriff's offer. Take James to town while I stay here to watch the property." "No," Rebecca's response was immediate and firm. "We stay together, all of us. I won't leave you here alone, and I won't separate James from both of us." Thomas wanted to argue further, to insist on their safety, but he recognized the determination in Rebecca's eyes. This was her home, her stand to make. And James was her son, her responsibility and priority above all else. "Then we prepare more thoroughly," he said instead. "Move essential supplies into the root cellar in case we need a fallback position. Keep James inside after dark, and establish clear signals between us in case we need to communicate under fire." Rebecca nodded, her expression resolute despite the fear Thomas could see beneath it. "I'll start preparations now, while there's still daylight." As dusk approached, they implemented these additional security measures. The root cellar, a small underground room accessible through a trapdoor in the cabin floor, was stocked with water, food, blankets, and ammunition. James was told it was a game of fort building, a special hiding place in case of visitors in the night. After James was settled for sleep in the cabin's sleeping area, Thomas and Rebecca sat at the table, speaking in low voices as they finalized their plans for the night and the following day. "If anything happens," Thomas said, cleaning his rifle as they talked, "your priority is James. Get him to the root cellar and stay there. The walls are earth and stone, they'll stop most bullets." Rebecca nodded, her own weapons laid out before her, the revolver and shotgun, both cleaned and loaded. "And you?" "I'll keep them occupied, create enough distraction for you to reach safety." Thomas met her eyes directly. "Then I'll join you if possible." "If possible," she repeated softly, hearing the qualification in his words. "Thomas, I won't leave you out there alone if things turn bad." "Yes, you will," he replied firmly, "because James needs you more than I do." Rebecca held his gaze for a long moment, then looked away, blinking rapidly against what might have been tears. "I hate this," she said quietly. "The violence, the fear, it's not what Daniel and I came west for. We wanted to build something, not destroy." Thomas set his rifle aside, reaching across the table to take her hand. "You are building something, Rebecca, something worth protecting, worth fighting for." She looked down at their joined hands, then back to his face. "And what are you fighting for, Thomas?" "Still just doing the right thing to remember who you are." The question hung between them, loaded with unspoken implications. Thomas found himself unable to offer the casual response that would have come so easily just days ago. "Not just that," he admitted finally, "not anymore." Rebecca's eyes softened, understanding what he couldn't quite bring himself to say. Her hand turned in his, fingers interlacing. For a moment they sat in silence, connected by more than their shared predicament or common cause. Then Rebecca gently withdrew her hand, rising from the table. "We should both try to get some rest before our watch shifts. Tomorrow will be a crucial day, one way or another." Thomas nodded, understanding her practical focus and respecting it. They were on the eve of potential conflict, with a child's safety at stake. Personal feelings, however compelling, had to remain secondary to survival and protection. As Rebecca checked on James one final time before taking her place at the watch position, Thomas extinguished the lamps and moved to his own station by the front door. Outside, the night was darker than the previous one, clouds obscuring stars and moon alike. Perfect conditions for an approach, but also more difficult for attackers to coordinate their movements. Thomas settled in for his vigil, rifle across his lap and senses attuned to any disturbance in the night sounds around the homestead. Despite the tension of their situation, he found himself oddly at peace. For the first time in years, he was fighting for something that mattered to him personally, not just as a hired gun or temporary ally. Whatever came with the dawn, that clarity of purpose was its own kind of freedom. The attack, when it came, arrived with the false dawn, that gray period between night and morning when visibility was poor and sleepers were at their most vulnerable. Thomas had been awake, having taken the final watch shift from Rebecca 2 hours earlier, but even his vigilance nearly missed the first signs of approach. It was a slight movement at the edge of the cornfield that caught his attention, too deliberate to be wind, too large to be a coyote or fox. Thomas tensed, peering through the cabin's front window, and gradually discerned the silhouettes of men moving in a wide arc toward the cabin, using the crops as partial cover. He moved swiftly to where Rebecca slept in a chair near James's bed, touching her shoulder lightly. She awoke instantly, fully alert without the confusion that typically accompanied interrupted sleep. "They're here," Thomas whispered. "At least 4 that I can see, coming through the cornfield." Rebecca nodded, immediately moving to wake James as they had planned. The boy stirred groggily, but remained quiet as his mother quickly explained that they needed to use their special hiding place now. Thomas positioned himself at the window again, counting silhouettes in the growing light. 6 men total, moving with the coordination of those accustomed to working together. "Ready?" Rebecca whispered from behind him, James now fully dressed and clutching a small bundle of his most treasured possessions, a wooden horse his father had carved, a picture book, and a small quilt. Thomas nodded. "Wait for my signal. I'll try to draw them away from the cellar entrance." Before Rebecca could respond, a voice called from outside, Garrett Churchill's foreman. "Mrs. Adler, we know you're in there, Mr. Churchill has authorized me to offer one final chance to leave peacefully, with compensation for your property." Thomas and Rebecca exchanged glances. The formal announcement was likely for appearance's sake, establishing that they had offered terms before resorting to force, should questions arise later. It's not yet Saturday, Rebecca called back, moving carefully to keep away from the windows. The bank doesn't open until noon. We'll be in town to meet with the territorial representative. A brief silence followed, suggesting this information about the territorial official might be new to Garrett. Then his voice returned, harder now. There's been a change of plans, Mrs. Adler. Mr. Churchill has obtained legal authorization to secure the property immediately, given concerns about potential damage or livestock theft. That's a lie, Rebecca whispered to Thomas, who nodded grimly. Churchill was clearly improvising, creating legal-sounding justifications for what amounted to armed seizure. We'll need to see that authorization, Thomas called out, wanting to keep them talking while he assessed their positions and intentions. Bring it to the door unarmed and we'll review it. A harsh laugh answered him. I don't think so, Steele. Our orders are to secure this property by any means necessary. Mrs. Adler and the boy won't be harmed if they come out now. You, on the other hand, are trespassing on what is legally Churchill property as of this morning. Thomas used their conversation to pinpoint Garrett's position, behind the water trough about 30 yards from the cabin's front door. The other men had spread out in a loose semicircle, using various outbuildings and farm implements as cover. Rebecca, he said quietly, take James to the cellar now. I'm going to create a distraction. Thomas, she began, but he cut her off with a gentle squeeze of her arm. Trust me, he said simply. Keep him safe. I'll handle this. Something in his tone must have convinced her because Rebecca nodded, gathering James close. Be careful, she whispered, then added, almost too softly to hear, come back to us. Before Thomas could process the implication of those words, she had moved swiftly to the trapdoor, hidden beneath a rug in the corner of the main room. Within moments, she and James had disappeared into the root cellar, the door closed and concealed once more beneath the rug, and a heavy trunk Thomas had positioned for additional protection. Alone now, Thomas took a deep breath, centered himself, and called out to Garrett again. I'm coming out to talk, hold your fire. Without waiting for a response, he moved to the side window rather than the front door, carefully easing it open. Using a technique he had learned during the war, Thomas placed his hat on the end of his rifle barrel and slowly raised it into view through the window, a classic diversion to draw fire and reveal the attackers' positions. The response was immediate. 2 shots rang out, splintering the window frame and sending Thomas's hat flying. In that same instant, Thomas was moving, low and fast, to the cabin's rear door. He slipped outside while the attacker's attention was focused on the window, circling behind the chicken coop to gain a better vantage point. From his new position, Thomas could see the 6 men more clearly, Garrett and another man by the water trough, 2 more using the woodpile for cover, and the final pair crouched behind the overturned cart near the barn. All were armed with rifles or shotguns, their attention still fixed on the cabin's front and the window where they'd seen movement. Thomas aimed carefully and fired twice in rapid succession, targeting the ground near the men rather than the men themselves. His goal was disruption and confusion, not death, at least not yet. The shots had the desired effect, sending Churchill's men diving for better cover and momentarily diverting their focus from the cabin to search for this new threat. That's a warning, Thomas called out, quickly changing position again to avoid return fire. The next shots won't miss. Take your men and leave now, Garrett. A volley of bullets answered him, splintering wood where he had been moments before. Thomas ducked behind the barn's corner, calculating his next move. He needed to keep the attackers focused on him, away from the cabin and the hidden cellar entrance. Ideally, he would drive them off entirely, but Churchill's men seemed prepared for a prolonged engagement. For the next several minutes, Thomas engaged in a deadly game of cat and mouse around the homestead buildings, firing just often enough to keep the attackers cautious while conserving his limited ammunition. He managed to wound one of the men, a leg shot that took him out of the fight without being fatal, but the remaining 5 maintained disciplined coverage of each other as they gradually tightened their perimeter around the cabin. Thomas realized their strategy was becoming clear. They were positioning to rush the cabin from multiple directions simultaneously, overwhelming any defense with sheer numbers. He needed to disrupt their coordination before they could execute this plan. Circling behind the barn, Thomas spotted the hay wagon positioned near the corral. In a swift decision, he darted toward it, igniting his remaining matches and setting the dry hay ablaze. Within seconds, the wagon was engulfed in flames, creating both a dramatic diversion and a barrier between two groups of attackers. The fire had an immediate impact, forcing Churchill's men to abandon their careful positioning as they scrambled to avoid the rapidly spreading flames. In the confusion, Thomas managed to take out another attacker with a shot to the shoulder, reducing their effective force to 4. But his position was compromised now, revealed by the firelight. A bullet grazed his left arm, tearing through shirt and skin with a white-hot line of pain. Thomas ducked behind a water barrel, gritting his teeth against the injury. The wound wasn't serious, barely more than a deep scratch, but the blood would make his grip slippery and his movements more detectable. "Give it up, Steele," Garrett called from somewhere to his right. "The cabin's surrounded, fire's spreading toward it, you've got no way out." Thomas glanced toward the cabin and felt his blood chill. Garrett was right, the fire had caught the edge of the cornfield and was being driven toward the cabin by the morning breeze. If it reached the wooden structure, Rebecca and James would be trapped in the root cellar beneath a burning building. The realization forced an immediate change in Thomas's priorities. He needed to reach the cabin, get Rebecca and James out of the cellar, and find them a safe escape route, all while under fire from Churchill's remaining men. Using the growing smoke as partial cover, Thomas began working his way toward the cabin, firing occasionally to keep the attackers at bay. The wound in his arm throbbed with each movement, but he pushed the pain aside, focusing entirely on reaching the cabin before the fire did. He was halfway there when Garrett and another man spotted him, opening fire with a concentrated volley that forced Thomas to dive behind the chicken coop. Splinters flew as bullets tore through the thin wooden structure, narrowly missing him. Thomas returned fire, more to force them into cover than with any real hope of hitting them through the smoke. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. The fire now edged the cabin's rear corner, and more of Churchill's men were converging on his position. Thomas realized with grim clarity that he couldn't reach the cabin entrance without exposing himself to multiple firing lines. Then, unexpectedly, a new sound cut through the chaos, the distinctive report of a shotgun from within the cabin. One of Churchill's men cried out, falling back with a wound to his leg and side. A moment later, the cabin door flew open and Rebecca appeared, shotgun braced against her shoulder as she fired again, driving the attackers back. Thomas seized the opportunity, sprinting toward the cabin under Rebecca's covering fire. He reached the door just as she was retreating inside, bullets splintering the doorframe around them. "James," he gasped as they secured the door behind him. "Still in the cellar," Rebecca replied, her face smudged with soot but her eyes clear and determined. "I came up when I smelled smoke." The fires nearly reached the back wall. Thomas nodded grimly. "We need to get out of here. The cellar won't be safe if the cabin burns." Together they moved to the trapdoor, quickly removing the concealing trunk. Thomas lifted the heavy door while Rebecca called softly to James. The boy emerged moments later, eyes wide with fear, but remarkably composed for a 5-year-old in the midst of gunfire and approaching flames. "We need to run to the creek," Thomas explained, kneeling to James's level. "Stay low, stay between your mama and me. Can you do that, partner?" James nodded solemnly, clutching his small bundle of possessions. "Like a rabbit, right, low and fast." "Exactly like that," Thomas agreed, feeling a surge of pride at the boy's courage. He turned to Rebecca. "I'll go first, draw their fire. When I signal, bring him out the side door and head straight for the creek bed. It's low enough to provide cover all the way to the tree line." Rebecca checked her shotgun, then nodded. "We'll be right behind you." Thomas paused, struck by her calm competence in the face of such danger. Without thinking, he reached out, cupping her face briefly with his hand. "Rebecca." "Later," she said softly, understanding in her eyes. "Tell me later when we're safe." He nodded, squeezing her shoulder once before moving to the front window. Through the smoke and early morning light, he could see Churchill's men regrouping after Rebecca's unexpected defense. The fire had now fully caught one corner of the cabin, and smoke was beginning to fill the interior. Thomas broke the remaining glass from the window, then fired rapidly at the attackers, deliberately aiming to force them into cover rather than to kill. As they ducked and returned fire, he moved swiftly to the front door, flung it open, and continued firing as he sprinted toward the water trough. The diversion worked, all attention focused on him, as bullets kicked up dirt around his running figure. Thomas dove behind the trough, coming up firing to maintain the attacker's focus. From the corner of his eye, he saw Rebecca emerge from the side door. James clutched close to her side as they ran in a low crouch toward the creek bed. Thomas continued firing, emptying his revolver to cover their escape. When Garrett and his men realized what was happening and began to shift their fire toward the fleeing pair, Thomas abandoned his cover, charging toward the nearest attacker with reckless determination. He tackled the man before he could draw a bead on Rebecca, driving him to the ground and wrestling for control of his rifle. The struggle was brief but vicious, ending with Thomas delivering a powerful blow that left his opponent unconscious. He grabbed the man's rifle and rolled behind a stack of lumber as bullets splintered the wood around him. From his new position, Thomas could see Rebecca and James had nearly reached the creek bed, just a few more yards to relative safety. Then disaster struck. As Rebecca helped James down the steep bank of the creek, her foot slipped on loose stones. She fell awkwardly, crying out in pain as her ankle twisted beneath her. James froze, caught between continuing to safety and returning to help his mother. Thomas didn't hesitate. Rising from cover, he fired the rifle repeatedly, forcing Garrett and his remaining men to duck. In that moment of suppression, Thomas sprinted toward Rebecca and James, bullets kicking up dirt around him as the attackers recovered and returned fire. He reached them just as Rebecca was struggling to her feet, her face white with pain. "I can walk," she insisted, but her leg buckled when she tried to put weight on it. Without discussion, Thomas handed her the rifle, then scooped James up with one arm and supported Rebecca with the other. Together they half ran, half stumbled along the creek bed, using its steep banks as cover from the gunfire that still pursued them. They had nearly reached the tree line when Thomas felt a sudden impact, like a hammer blow to his side. The force of it nearly drove him to his knees, but he gritted his teeth and kept moving, propelling Rebecca and James forward through sheer determination. Only when they reached the shelter of the pines did Thomas allow himself to acknowledge the wound. His shirt was soaked with blood, a bullet having found its mark just below his ribs on the right side. The pain, initially dulled by adrenaline, was rapidly intensifying, each breath becoming a struggle. "Thomas," Rebecca gasped, noticing his pallor and the spreading bloodstain, "you're hit." He nodded grimly, lowering James to the ground and leaning heavily against a tree. "Need to keep moving," he managed. "They'll follow our trail." Rebecca quickly tore a strip from her petticoat, pressing it against his wound with firm pressure that made him wince despite his attempt to hide his pain from James. The boy watched with wide, frightened eyes, his small face pale beneath smudges of dirt and soot. "Is Mr. Steele going to die?" he asked in a small voice. "No," Rebecca answered firmly, meeting Thomas's gaze with a look that brooked no argument. "He is not going to die. We're going to help him, and we're all going to be fine." Thomas tried to smile reassuringly at James, though he suspected it emerged as more of a grimace. The wound was serious, not immediately fatal, but debilitating enough to slow their escape significantly. And with Churchill's men certainly in pursuit, that reduced speed could prove deadly for all of them. "The Holloway cabin," he said suddenly, remembering a detail from previous conversations. "Miss Holloway's brother has a trapping cabin about 2 miles east of here, near the fork in the creek. You mentioned it when discussing possible shelter if the weather turned before harvest." Rebecca's eyes widened in recognition. "Yes, it's small but solid. Jack Holloway uses it during trapping season, but he's working the silver mines until fall." "Head there," Thomas instructed, pushing himself upright with a suppressed groan. "Follow the creek to avoid leaving an obvious trail. I'll create a false track heading north, then circle back to join you." Rebecca immediately shook her head. "No, we stay together. You're too badly injured to be setting false trails." "Rebecca," Thomas said quietly, glancing meaningfully at James, "they're looking for 3 people. If they follow me, thinking I have both of you, you and James have a better chance." She understood his meaning. He was offering himself as bait, a diversion to protect her son. Her eyes filled with tears of frustration and fear, but before she could argue further, the sound of voices reached them, Churchill's men, having found their trail and following it toward the trees. "Go," Thomas urged, more forcefully now. "Take James to safety. I'll find you at the cabin." For a moment Rebecca seemed torn between practical necessity and emotional refusal. Then James spoke up, his small voice surprisingly steady. "Mama, Mr. Steele is a hero. Heroes always come back." The simple childish faith in those words seemed to settle something for both adults. Rebecca nodded once, decisively, then reached out to touch Thomas's face, a brief, tender gesture that conveyed everything words couldn't in that moment. "We'll wait for you," she said simply, Don't you dare disappoint my son." Then she was gathering James close, supporting her injured ankle with a sturdy branch as a makeshift cane, and moving deeper into the forest along the creek's path. Thomas watched them go, memorizing the sight of them together, Rebecca's straight back and protective arm around James's shoulders, the boy's occasional glance back toward Thomas with perfect trust in his eyes. When they had disappeared among the trees, Thomas forced himself upright and began moving in a different direction, deliberately leaving a clear trail heading north, away from Rebecca and James's actual route. The effort cost him dearly, each step sending waves of pain through his wounded side, but the knowledge of what was at stake drove him forward, despite the growing weakness in his limbs. He had gone perhaps a quarter mile, blood now soaking through the makeshift bandage and dripping occasionally onto fallen leaves, when he heard the pursuers growing closer. Thomas increased his pace, wanting to draw them as far from Rebecca and James as possible before they caught up to him. Finally, when he could go no farther without risking collapse, Thomas found a defensible position behind a fallen tree and prepared for what might be his final stand. He checked the rifle, 3 rounds remaining. His revolver was empty, left behind during their escape from the cabin. It would have to be enough. The first of Churchill's men appeared minutes later, Garrett himself, leading 2 others. They moved cautiously, rifles ready, following the trail Thomas had deliberately left for them to find. Thomas remained perfectly still, controlling his breathing despite the fire in his side, waiting for the perfect moment. When the men were within optimal range, Thomas fired twice in rapid succession. His first shot caught one man in the shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him to the forest floor. The second missed Garrett narrowly as the foreman dove for cover with impressive speed. "Steele," Garrett called from behind a thick pine. "Where's the woman and boy?" "Gone," Thomas answered, his voice stronger than he felt. "Far beyond your reach by now." Garrett laughed harshly. "You're bleeding out, Steele. We can follow the trail you're leaving like a wounded deer. Tell us where they're headed, and maybe we can get you to a doctor before it's too late." Thomas smiled grimly, though no one could see it. "Rather die here than help you hunt them down." "Your choice," Garrett replied coldly, "though it's a shame. Churchill might have been willing to let you live, given the circumstances." "Professional respect and all that." "Churchill has no respect for anything but power and money," Thomas said, using the conversation to locate Garrett's position more precisely. "And when the territorial officials learn what happened here today, he'll have a lot less of both." This seemed to strike a nerve. "No officials coming," Garrett snapped. "That was just a rumor, another of your manipulations." Thomas filed this information away. Either Garrett was lying to demoralize him, or Churchill had deliberately misled his men about the territorial representative's arrival. Either way, it suggested their position might be more desperate than they had let on. The third man had been working his way around Thomas's flank during this exchange, attempting to approach from the side while Garrett kept him talking. Thomas caught the movement from the corner of his eye and shifted slightly, holding his final shot in reserve. "Churchill sent 6 men to drive a widow and child from their home," Thomas called out, keeping Garrett's attention while tracking the flanking man's progress. "Doesn't exactly speak to his confidence in his legal position." "Legal, illegal, that's just words on paper," Garrett replied dismissively. "Out here, it's about who has the strength to hold what they claim. Churchill has that strength. Your widow friend doesn't." "She has more strength than you know," Thomas said, and meant it. He had seen Rebecca fight for her family with a ferocity that shamed most men. He tracked the flanking movement of the third man through the brush. He had 1 bullet left. He couldn't waste it on suppression fire. He had to wait for a clear shot. The flanker broke cover, raising his rifle. Thomas fired. The man cried out, spinning away as the bullet took him in the leg. But the recoil and the movement cost Thomas. His wounded side screamed in protest, his vision graying for a split second. It was enough for Garrett. The foreman broke from behind the pine tree, covering the distance between them in 3 long strides. He didn't shoot, he used his rifle like a club. Thomas tried to roll, but he was too slow. The stock caught him in the shoulder, driving him back against the fallen log. Thomas's rifle flew from his hands. He scrambled for his knife, but Garrett was on him, pinning him with superior weight. Garrett's hand closed around Thomas's throat, squeezing off his air. "You've been a thorn in my side for 3 days, Steele," Garrett snarled, his face inches from Thomas's, twisted with exertion and malice. "Churchill said to make it look like an accident if possible, but out here, well, wolves got to eat too." Thomas clawed at Garrett's arm, but his strength was failing. The blood loss, the pain, the lack of oxygen. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket pulling him down. He thought of James. Don't disappoint my son. He thought of Rebecca. He managed to land a weak punch to Garrett's ribs, but the foreman just laughed, tightening his grip. Black spots danced in Thomas's vision. I tried, he thought, a wave of bitter regret washing over him. I tried to be the hero. Then a gunshot cracked through the forest. It wasn't the sharp crack of a Winchester or the boom of a shotgun. It was the heavy, authoritative roar of a peacemaker. Garrett stiffened. The pressure on Thomas's throat vanished instantly as the foreman slumped to the side, clutching his shoulder where a fresh bloom of red appeared. Thomas gasped, sucking in air that tasted of pine needles and dirt. He rolled onto his side, coughing, trying to clear his vision. Standing at the edge of the clearing, smoking revolver in hand, was Sheriff Wilson, but he wasn't alone. Beside him stood a man in a dusty suit holding a notepad, looking pale but resolute, and behind them, 2 deputies with shotguns leveled at Garrett. "That's enough, Garrett," Sheriff Wilson said, his voice devoid of its usual caution. "Drop the weapons now." Garrett groaned, looking at his rifle lying in the dirt, then at the deputies. He slumped back against the log, defeated. "Sheriff, you're out of your jurisdiction." "Not when I'm escorting Mr. Harrison here," Wilson gestured to the man in the suit, Territorial Land Commissioner. He arrived on the early stage. Wanted to see for himself how land disputes are handled in Whitetail Creek. I'd say he's seen plenty. Mr. Harrison stepped forward, adjusting his spectacles. He looked from the wounded Thomas to the armed foreman. "Attempted murder," he noted dryly. "Assault, arson. I believe I have enough for a federal indictment, Sheriff." We were apprehending a trespasser," Garrett wheezed, trying one last lie. "We found the woman and the boy, Garrett," Wilson said coldly. "They told us everything." Thomas let his head fall back against the moss. "They found them. They're safe." The adrenaline that had sustained him finally evaporated, leaving only a deep, numbing cold. He heard footsteps approaching him, heavy boots crunching on leaves. "Steele," it was the sheriff's voice sounding far away. "Can you hear me, son? Stay with us." Thomas tried to nod, but his body wouldn't obey. The forest canopy above him began to spin, the patches of blue sky blurring into a single, bright light. His last thought before the darkness took him completely was of a pair of green eyes, and a promise he had desperately wanted to keep. Part 2, The Recovery. The first thing Thomas noticed was the smell, not the metallic tang of blood or the damp scent of the forest, but sage, wood smoke, and lavender. He opened his eyes. He was staring at a ceiling he recognized. Tightly fitted logs chinked with care, a stone fireplace. He tried to sit up, but a sharp pain in his side pinned him back to the mattress. "Easy," a soft voice commanded. "You'll tear the stitches." Thomas turned his head. Rebecca was sitting in the rocking chair by the hearth, mending his shirt. She set it aside and moved to the bed, her face etched with relief. "Rebecca," his voice was a rusty croak. "Drink," she said, lifting a cup of water to his lips. He drank greedily. "How long?" he rasped. 3 days, she told him, brushing a lock of hair from his forehead, a gesture so tender it made his chest ache more than the wound. "The doctor says the bullet missed anything vital, but you lost a lot of blood. You need rest." Thomas looked around the room, the cabin, the fire. "Scorch marks on the back wall," she dismissed it with a wave of her hand. "James and I scrubbed most of it off. The structure is sound." "James. Outside with Rusty." "He's grooming your horse, again." She smiled, though her eyes were shiny. "He thinks if he treats Rusty like a king, Rusty will tell you to wake up." Thomas let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. "And Churchill." Rebecca's expression hardened with satisfaction. "In a cell in Helena awaiting trial. It turns out Mr. Harrison, the land commissioner, takes a very dim view of cattle barons who use private armies to evict widows. He confiscated Churchill's records. They found evidence of bribery, fraud. His empire is crumbling, Thomas." "And the land." Rebecca reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a thick envelope, the stage from St. Louis arrived yesterday. My father sent everything. The marriage certificate, Daniel's death record, even a letter of character reference from the mayor of St. Louis. She placed the envelope on the bedside table. "Mr. Harrison reviewed them this morning. The deed is officially mine. Ours, James's." She looked at him, her hand resting on his arm. "You did it, Thomas. You saved us." Thomas looked at the ceiling, overwhelmed. He had fought battles before, but he had never won a victory like this, a victory that resulted in life, not just survival. The sheriff, Thomas muttered. He came. He did, Rebecca agreed. He told me later that your conversation in town shamed him. He realized he couldn't just stand by anymore. When the commissioner arrived early, Wilson brought him straight out here. Thomas closed his eyes, feeling the pull of sleep again. He was safe, they were safe. For the first time in years, he didn't have to sleep with one eye open. Part 3, The Departure. It took another week before Thomas was strong enough to walk without dizziness. He spent the days sitting on the porch, whittling with James or watching Rebecca work in the garden. It was a domestic idol he had never let himself imagine could be his, but as his strength returned, so did the old itch. The familiar voice in his head that told him this was temporary. He was a drifter, a man of violence. He had served his purpose here, the protector, the fighter. Now that the fight was over, what place was there for a man like him in a house of peace? He watched Rebecca laughing with James as they gathered corn. They were a family, complete. He was just the hired gun who stayed too long. On a Tuesday morning, 10 days after the shootout, Thomas made his decision. Rebecca was down at the creek washing linens. James was in the barn, supposedly mucking out the stalls but mostly playing with the barn cats. Thomas moved stiffly around the cabin, gathering his few possessions. He rolled his bedroll. He checked his revolver, cleaned and reloaded by the sheriff before it was returned. He packed his saddlebags. He moved quietly to the barn, saddling Rusty with practiced efficiency. He told himself it was better this way. No tearful goodbyes. No awkward conversations where they felt obligated to offer him a place out of gratitude, and he felt obligated to refuse out of pride. He would just slip away, leaving them to the life he had helped secure. He led Rusty out of the stall, Mr. Steele. Thomas froze. He turned to see James standing in the barn doorway, a pitchfork in his hand that was twice his size. The boy's face crumpled. "You're saddling Rusty," James said, his voice wobbling. Yes," Thomas stammered. He had faced down gunfire with steadier nerves than this. "It's time for me to go, James. The bad men are gone. You and your mama are safe." But James dropped the pitchfork. "But you promised to teach me to gallop." "You know enough," Thomas said gently. "You're the man of the house now, James. You take care of your mama." "No," James shouted, tears spilling over. "I don't want to be the man of the house. I want you." Thomas winced. "James." "Mama," James screamed, turning and running out of the barn. "Mama. He's leaving." Thomas closed his eyes and leaned his forehead against Rusty's saddle. Coward, he thought. You can face a bullet, but you can't face a goodbye. He heard running footsteps. Then Rebecca was there. She stood in the barn entrance, breathless, her hands wet from the creek, James clinging to her skirts and sobbing. She took in the scene instantly, the packed saddlebags, the saddled horse, Thomas standing there with his hat in his hand. "You were just going to leave?" she asked, her voice quiet but shaking, without a word. "I didn't want to make a fuss," Thomas said, looking at the ground. "My job is done, Rebecca. You have your deed." "You're safe." "Is that all this was to you?" she asked, stepping into the barn. "A job." "No," Thomas looked up, stung. "You know it wasn't. That's why I have to go." "That makes no sense," she said, anger flashing in her green eyes. "It makes perfect sense," Thomas argued, his voice rising. "Look at me, Rebecca. I'm a drifter. I have a gun, a horse, and a history of violence. You have a home, you have a future. You don't need a worn-out cowboy cluttering up your life." "Don't you dare tell me what I need," she snapped, closing the distance between them. "I had a husband who was perfect on paper, Thomas. He was safe and respectable, and he died leaving me alone. You came from nowhere and risked your life for strangers. You saved my son, you saved our home." She stopped just inches from him, looking up into his face. "You saved the land, Thomas. Don't leave our hearts empty." Thomas looked at her. He saw the same strength he had admired from the first moment in town, but he also saw love, not gratitude. "Love. I don't know how to do this," he admitted, his voice breaking. "I don't know how to stay." James let go of his mother's skirt and stepped forward. He grabbed Thomas's rough, calloused hand in his small ones. "Mr. Steele," the boy asked, sniffling, "don't you have a home somewhere else?" Thomas looked down at the boy. He thought of the Missouri farm that was dust. He thought of the cold nights on the trail. He thought of the empty hotel rooms and the silence of his own life. Then he looked at the barn he had defended. He looked at the woman who had bandaged his wounds and sat by his bedside for 3 days. He looked at the boy who thought he was a hero. He slowly uncurled his fingers from the reins. He dropped the saddlebags to the dirt floor. He knelt down until he was eye level with James. He reached out and wiped a tear from the boy's cheek. "I didn't," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion, "but I think I just found it." Rebecca let out a sob and dropped to her knees beside them, wrapping her arms around both of them. Thomas buried his face in her neck, breathing in the scent of lavender and peace, finally letting the walls fall down.